participants, and hence the rather delayed time at 4:45 in the evening today, as opposed to typically when we do it at about 2 o'clock. So the reason why we wanted to do this conference was that if you think about the nature of the global internet, the shift that has taken place in terms of privacy laws, privacy policies, the way the data transfers being regulated, we wanted to have to bring in voices from outside India into this conversation, and essentially broaden our perspectives. I hope that this year we're doing it online, and that allows us to bring more voices in virtually, in accordance with time zones that currently are stretching from Australia to Brazil for today. And hopefully next year we want to do this conference offline, where we're all able to meet IRL. So we've had over 500 registrations for these 2 days, and I know that people will join and leave intermittently. I hope that we'll be able to provide you with enough to think about and mull over as we move towards a privacy legislation in India. This discussion will be live streamed, and so if you miss anything, please feel free to visit our YouTube channel to watch the rest of it. I know that many of you are MediaNama subscribers and sponsors. Thank you for enabling our work. In case you'd like to support our work and subscribe to MediaNama, we'll leave a link in the comments. Your support allows us to do the work that we do. Just a few logistical points. If you'd like to ask a question during the session, there's a Q&A module on your screen. There should be a button on Zoom. So we'll take up questions as the panels progress. We have about half an hour in each session for Q&A that we'll pick up. But I mean, we can always pick up questions during the conversation as well. We have the privilege of having some great scholarship amongst our speakers today, and across regions. And there's a subject that I deeply care about, which is bodies and data protection, which I feel that we haven't explored as much as we should have. Tomorrow's session is going to be more focused on operationalization of privacy legislation. So we'll have both data protection commissioners and chief privacy officers speaking about how data protection commissioners are actually going about the business of being data protection commissioners. And with chief privacy officers, it means an entire organizational shift about how you're thinking about data, how various departments are thinking about data. I mean, marketing departments have never really worried too much about privacy and where they're getting their data from, especially in India. So we want to understand from global organizations about how they're managing to adapt to different privacy legislations across the world, and how products are changing, how marketing practices are changing, and the role of the chief privacy officer in a company. Arun, we can go live now. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the first day of the very first PrivacyNama conference. Our thinking behind this conference was to focus on 3 particular themes. First, on bodies and data protection. Especially during COVID, we've seen a substantial increase in the deployment of data collection tools that are capturing biometric data, both public and private, and both online and offline. And we wanted to discuss what is happening and what tools we have to deal with these issues. Secondly, we wanted to understand that data protection at some level is being looked at from an economic lens. That data is an economic asset, and data protection laws that are meant to protect privacy are being used to serve economic interests. So what does this do for citizen rights? How does this push for data sovereignty and control over data in order to extract as much economic advantage from it for the country? How does that impact the openness of the internet? We'll explore some of these themes in our second panel today. Tomorrow is going to be about the operationalization, how our data protection commissioners working, what makes their jobs difficult, how are data protection legislations being operationalized, how are data transfers being enabled between jurisdictions, what kind of negotiations take place. And lastly, in terms of what skills and tools the chief privacy officers need to have to reshape their organizations to deal with privacy and data protection laws. There are many people who have made this conference possible. I'd like to thank Flipkart, Facebook, Internet Society, Mozilla, the Mobile Premier League, uh, Umedia Network, Paytm, Star India, and Xiaomi for their support. We're thankful to our community partners, the Cyber BRICS project, the Center for Internet and Society, and the Center for Communications Governance at the National Law University, Delhi, for their help in putting together this program. I'd also like to thank Paroma Bhatt from Process, NASPERS, Jalak Kakkar from CCG at NLU Delhi, Rajneet Singh from ISOC, Rohit and Deepro from the Quantum Hub, Kailash Karthikeyan from Jaswal Consulting, and of course, Anya Kovacs from the Internet Democracy Project, and Luca Belli from Cyber BRICS for their support for this discussion. There are many people that have helped us put this discussion together in super quick time. Hopefully next year we'll take about 3 months to do this. But before we begin, I wanted to share some thoughts that I've put together on the idea of privacy, just a philosophical take to try and go back to the basics. So, here's what we know to be true about privacy. Firstly, there is a global market failure in privacy. We get reminders about this every day when we learn about privacy violations of various companies and their practices. There isn't a necessity and proportionality standard in play for most companies in terms of the data they collect, how they share data within their organization, how they use this data, how their organizations are buying and selling data, and just in terms of selling access to usage of data as well. Secondly, there will always be people who will say that if you don't have anything to hide, why do you worry about privacy? The only people who have something to hide are the ones who worry about privacy. So we'll always have people like that. We also, as people, we don't know what data has been collected about us, by whom, and how they're using it. This isn't just true of personal information, but also how much time we spend staring at the screen, whose profile we check out, whom we message, and how often, what medicines we buy, what doctor appointments we book, which tutorials we look at, what videos we watch, how often, let's say when someone's scanning the web for baby clothes, we're being watched all the time, and it's not something that most of us are acutely aware of. Then there are people who tend to care less about business getting access to their intentions and their habits through data than a person they know. So there are many people who would say that, I don't mind giving my data to a company, but I don't want someone I know getting access to it. Who they give access to depends on trust and their perception of how that business, that person, or even the government can harm them or interact with them. The more they know about the data being collected about them, the more obvious it is, the more they tend to care about it. There is no such thing as 100% anonymization. We are leaving trails everywhere. And even if we don't, there's sufficient non-personal data being collected in a manner that can identify some things about us in some shape and form. So there's no such thing as 100% anonymization. As we all know, consent is tiring but necessary. As a friend once said, consent is my right to say no. While we need to regulate for harms, we also cannot do away with consent. Data, as Bruce Schneier famously said, is a toxic asset. And the potential for harm with the data being collected about us is much greater than the benefit, to us at least, of collecting it. It's just that it's only when we are harmed that we realize that we have been harmed. Then data is also an economic asset. It helps businesses refine their products, understand customers and their preferences better, and helps businesses make better decisions to serve us better. So it is a key economic asset. Data may be co-created, but privacy is individual and personal. We cannot depend on businesses to protect our privacy. We cannot depend on governments alone to protect our privacy. With the thing with developing markets is that they tend to look at data as a national asset. And there is a tension between privacy laws for markets that see data as a means of speeding up economic development versus privacy laws that might restrict their access to data. So developing markets often view data as view privacy as an economic deterrent to growth. Data is power. Power is addictive, and hence data is addictive for many businesses, for many governments. But power is misused, and so data will also be misused. There's no major jurisdiction in the world can be without a privacy law within the next few years. There is no doubt that we will see the rollout of privacy laws, and the lives of citizens, of businesses will change forever. As privacy laws will come into force, and as public outrage over privacy violations increases, business models will have to change and evolve. But data protection laws need to apply retrospectively and not just prospectively in order to protect our rights. Courts are largely ill-equipped to identify proportionality in data collection and deal with privacy and data protection issues. It will take a generation, maybe two, to deal with how to bring about tangible change. But in the end, and I'll end with this, privacy is a fundamental right and we need to enforce it. And we must start now. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Neha Chaudhary for the first session on bodies and data protection. Neha?
Thank you. I am audible, right? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Nikhil, and to the entire team of MediaNama for putting this session together and for having us all here. Hopefully, like you said, the next edition, we'll all be meeting in person and we'll be doing this in person. But very excited for this panel and for this discussion today. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be chairing this. So thank you so very much. Now I know that there is a lot of ground that we want to cover in today's conversation on bodies and data protection. So we'll start right away, and I'll request the panelists, before you start answering the questions, if you could introduce yourself in one line to our audience, that will be great. I realize I haven't done that, but I'm Neha Chaudhary. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm a partner with Ikigai Law. We are a law and policy organization. Anya, I will start first with you, because I feel like your thinking, your research and approach to this subject might also help us set some context for the rest of our conversation on bodies and data protection. And I was reading your essay this morning, and I think that it's very powerful and very evocatively titled as well. When your bodies become data, really, where does that leave us? Could you help start us off by helping us understand what it really means for us to be thinking about our bodies as data, as opposed to data that our bodies generate, or data that's really inferred from our bodies? Maybe if you could just start us off with that, and then there will be a couple of questions that I'll have for you that follow.
Thanks so much, Neha, and also thank you to Nikhil and to MediaNama for having me. I work with the Internet Democracy Project, normally based in Delhi, and we work on realizing feminist visions of the digital in society. Looking at data and bodies and how they are intertwined has been a core part of our work for about 3 or 4 years now. And when we started, a lot of people looked at me as if I was an alien coming from a different planet, kind of trying to put bodies back into this debate. And I think it shows how far we have come since then, and how much that perspective actually does speak to our practical experiences, that we have a session today at PrivacyNama that is completely devoted to this. I want to maybe start with a slightly provocative statement, though, in the sense that I want to break open this conversation and argue that not just biometric data, but all data that relates to people, whether we can identify them or not, is embodied data or used to affect our bodies and so has embodied consequences. And we need to get this link between our bodies and data to really see the full range of both the possibilities of what we can do with data, but also of the harms that come with data use. When you put bodies back into the debate, what you will see is that it is not only about privacy. And I think a lot of the challenges that Nikhil rightly pointed out in the introduction really are because we are expecting privacy right now to do a lot of work that it can't possibly do. We're kind of trying to make it responsible for all of these harms, while we can't even properly see the harms without making this connection where we put bodies back into the debate. At the moment, really what we do is we talk about data as a resource or as an asset, right? And what you then do is you talk about data in a really disembodied way, as if it's this thing that's just out there, ready to be mined. And in practice, what we see is that this does not match our experiences. And that in fact, our data and our body are so intimately interwoven that what we call our virtual bodies and our physical bodies, the line that is supposedly dividing these two becomes irrelevant, even if you can argue that maybe it exists. So let me give one example. I think perhaps most notably in India, because it's such an extreme example, is that where fingerprint authentication failures with Aadhaar lead to people being denied rations, which is a right they have under Indian law, because even if the ration shop owner has known your family for 30 years, if the machine and the data does not acknowledge that you are who you say you are, then the fact that you say you are who you are, and the person on the other side of the shop counter knows this, does not matter anymore. It is the data that actually has precedence. And we know that in India, this has led to people dying of starvation deaths because they didn't get their rations in time. Here, the data, the fingerprint authentication failure becomes a matter of life and death. That's not something you can simply cover anymore under a privacy law or a data protection law. Another example, Radhika Radhakrishnan has written a paper for the Internet Democracy Project looking at the growing promotion of health data use in India from this perspective under the National Digital Health Mission. And where she shows that as our notion of health data really expands and starts to include things that are not just clinical health data, actually the old protections that we have for supposedly this sensitive data become useless because so much of that data is not traditional clinical health data anymore. And yet we are using it to take decisions on the kinds of insurance people can get, possibly treatments they can get, etc., etc. I just want to give one more brief example to show like how really this is about all types of data, and that's location data. I always think it's so striking how easy we are about giving out location data. Well, imagine that somebody would be following you all day and know down where you were going. In the offline world, you would think this is crazy. If a policeman would do that, you would say that we're a surveillance state. And yet, the Karnataka government issued during the pandemic initially an app for people in quarantine where they had to send selfies every hour to show that they were in quarantine. This didn't go very far. Very few people ended up doing it, and they were wise enough not to impose it. But we've also seen all the stories about ASHA workers, community health workers in India, or sanitation workers who have been forced to actually allow GPS tracking of their movements throughout their entire working day. There are levels of control that we are now seeing and supposedly accepting that we just didn't do earlier. And I think this is really, really important to realize. When we put bodies into the debate, what we see is that there is a much broader, a fundamental restructuring going on of the relationships between people and big business, and between people and governments. And so we are creating new inequalities of a type that civil rights movements have fought against for decades now, right? So much of civil rights movement has been about trying to give people greater control over their bodies, over their lives, over their environments. And because we don't have the language to question this at the moment, because we talk about data in this completely disembodied way, we are seeing that actually all of these old inequalities are being put into place again. And it's as if we have to start fighting these struggles all over again. So really the argument I make is to start talking about data not anymore as an asset, though you talk about human resources in a company also to refer to people, but it's in a very limited context, right? I think our fundamental understanding and how we talk about data really should shift to put bodies fundamentally back in the center of this debate.
Thanks, Anya. I have a follow-up question on that, right? So you've spoken about really this idea of sort of greater empowerment and greater control. Where do you think consent really fits into everything that you've laid out? I'll go back to what Nikhil was saying earlier, where he said consent may be broken, but consent is actually necessary because that really sort of is the manifestation of my right to say no, or it's the manifestation of, I suppose, an imperfect manifestation, but it's the manifestation of the control really I have over my body and my data as well. And I'd be really curious to hear about lessons that you have from feminist theory, feminist principles, because again, this is something that you've spent a fair bit of time looking at. What are the lessons that we can really draw on from feminist scholarship or other kinds of civil rights scholarship really to make consent more meaningful in these conversations that we're having around data governance?
Thanks, Neha. Yes, when we started to think from this perspective, consent was one of the first areas that we really started to dig into, in part because, as you point out also, within feminism, consent has been, in the context of sexual relationships, a really strongly debated topic for such a long time, right? And so to then think about data as being embodied, that seemed like such a natural place to go and look for ways to strengthen consent. It was also really, really striking how different, like the way we talk about consent in sexual relations is, especially I think again with the Me Too movement also, that debate so strongly put on the agenda. And then if we look at how consent on the internet consists of ticking a box where supposedly we can completely sign away our right to privacy, there is no other fundamental right that you can sign away that completely, like your right to life. You cannot sign yourself into slavery or into bonded labor. We have said there is an essence of this right that needs to be protected. And yet on the internet, certainly with privacy, this seems to go away, right? So we started to look at the whole debate on feminism in more detail to see what are really some of the core principles that have emerged over the years in these debates. And there are, of course, things like that it should be possible always to negotiate in consent. That includes negotiations on the terms of the agreement, that consent is a process, it needs to be built step by step over time, etc. We have a whole list of principles and we've written a paper about this for anybody who's interested. But I think for me, the core lesson was really the big thing that feminism put on the table is that the autonomy in which the idea of consent is embedded is never individual. It is always relational. And so what that does is it puts power relationships really back at the center of the debate of what meaningful consent is, right? Because if your autonomy is always relational, that means that you can't presume, you can't assume that people are free and equal individuals already. You have to create the conditions that enable them to be free and equal conditions, and so to express consent meaningfully. And what we then saw was when we looked at data governance, that essentially consent is being used at the moment to legitimize this growing inequality that I was describing. And where the blame for that happening is put on us, right? Because this is what people will also say, but you've given all the data and you consented to it. So then it's your individual responsibility, certainly, that these power relationships are fundamentally so unequal. in the context of sexual relationships, you can clearly see like how unfair it is to put that burden on a single individual against a larger institution. And so we started to think about where then changes could be made. And we have identified at the moment 3 groups of changes. The first one's about what kind of data, at the moment that the data is collected in the first place. For example, it isn't clear to us at all why you should be forced to give data to third parties if that third party company is not doing something that essentially improves the service that you are availing of. At the very least, that is something that you should be able to say no to. Go on, question whether it should even be allowed. Then there are changes to what can happen with your data after you've given it, because at the moment, terms and conditions are so broad that basically you literally say, like, here is my data, now you do with it whatever you want, no matter what the actual details of the terms and conditions say. With too many services, that's the case. And most of the time, terms and conditions include clauses that say that we can unilaterally change this. And then you just are presumed to have agreed to it. We might at best inform you, but that's it. Is that even a practice that should be allowed? And then the third set of changes are really to think more about what do we need to protect groups or that perhaps in specific contexts are particularly vulnerable. We do this already for children, but for example, in the context of relationships between employers and employees, shouldn't we start doing this as well? The version of the data protection bill in India that is public still actually gives employers enormously broad access to data of their employees. But that's a really, really dangerous trend that we are going to. Is mental health data something that can affect your performance? Because if it is, then effectively under that bill, that is something that your employers might start tracking. And when you are using a keyboard, there is a lot they can come to know from you, right? So we really have to think also in these specific situations, where do power relationships come in and what do we need to do to make sure that the data that is available cannot be misused against whoever is the weakest partner in that relationship. So these are like 3 groups of changes, 3 broad areas. I've given an example in each, but I think there is much work we could do just if we start to think about each of these in more depth.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Anya. Beni, I'll come to you. I imagine some of these themes that Anya was talking about are also issues that you've engaged with, your colleagues at Dwara have engaged with on questions of vulnerability, right? And how people from say typically low income or low education backgrounds might be impacted differently by privacy harms, or really just how we think about privacy harms. I'm curious, I know you've done a little bit of work on dark patterns. I'm wondering, in your research, did you deal with questions, or can you extrapolate from your research if you've dealt with questions about any dangers of apps using similar dark patterns to obtain consent for any kind of information to do with our bodies, whether biometric information or not? And I think that might also tie into some of the dangers of consent that Anya was talking about earlier. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Neha. Hi, everybody. It's been really long that we've met, so this is kind of nice. Very quickly, I think there's nothing more that I can add, which Anya already has, but I can kind of give you examples that come from my context. I'm Beni Chok. I head the Future of Finance Initiative at Dwara Research. True to one line, what we do is we look at issues of consumer protection in digital financial services, especially from the vantage point of low-income consumers, and then obviously try to kind of solve them. Biggest issues of consumer protection in digital financial services are how the data is accessed, collected, used, processed, stored. So data processing and privacy are obviously one of the key kind of concerns in the delivery of digital financial services. I think the stakeholder group that we engage with is, I mean, way to stack up the deck, right? On one end, there's no access to finance. And therefore, there is this desperate need to kind of get hands to whatever financial resources that you could. And on the other hand, there is this whole kind of drive towards data-driven finance, which literally needs no bounds. Right now, we are at that stage where any form of inclusion or any kind of inclusion at whatever cost of data is welcome. And I think it's quite unfortunate, and we need to rethink about it for a couple of reasons. The way my team and I have broken this down to kind of just build some context for ourselves is there are almost two kinds of harms that can come from the use of data in data-driven finance. And when I say use of data, it's not to wholesale reject the use of data, but the use of very personal data, as my comments will probably kind of show in the future. So the two kinds of harms are, one is the privacy harm itself, which is the violation of privacy, which itself is a huge harm, not only because privacy is a fundamental right, cornerstone to all other rights, all of that, but because we have seen at the very last mile, there is this unambiguous expression of, wanting to preserve privacy. We've done this one very small qualitative study in 2017, which we have then followed up with an ongoing, soon to be published study, which actually kind of looked into 2,700 respondents belonging to low income kind of bracket. This is below 3 lakhs per annum. And what we have understood is we had a catalog of different kinds of information types, which we went to them with. And we said, would you like sharing this information with, say, financial institution? And yeses and nos were further qualified by reason. To give you an idea, I have some statistics here as I progress from, and I have picked out 3 out of the 36 information types that I have. True to the theme of the panel, I'm sticking to fingerprints, photographs, and mobile numbers just for comparison. There is a great deal of comfort in sharing mobile number with family, photographs with family, and fingerprints with family. And those yeses, yes, I would share, basically come from 2 grounds, which is I trust the people I'm sharing it with, or they are my family, and in most likelihood, they already have this information with them. So that's family. Things change drastically when I move from family to neighbors. The numbers that I have in front of me say that only 30% people would be okay sharing their photograph with neighbors, and 42% would not share information, not because they fear a harm, but simply because they say, this is my personal information. We have a separate category which asks people, would you not share it because it's harmful? The results there are at 9.4%. And this is a 2,700 odd sample, right? So it's not like obviously privacy is hard to generalize, but these results mean something, these percentages mean something. So what I'm trying to say is that just beyond the harm that can occur from sharing of personal data, at the very baseline, there is an expression of privacy. There is a claim of privacy which people don't want to violate. And I think this should be the starting point of all our conversations, because the harm approach is a bit tricky. The moment we go into the harms approach, we then think of, okay, how can we remedy harms? How can we prevent harms? How can we mitigate harms? All of those are extremely important consumer protection safeguards. But I think what is at stake is that intrinsic value of privacy, which needs to be understood, appreciated, and which needs to be seen as a constraint when businesses are designing their processes. So I think I just want to kind of get that point across. Now, coming back to your questions on consent, vulnerability, etc. I think consent, like Anya said, is about relative autonomy, right? So I might otherwise be a fairly independent person, but I really badly need a loan because in the pandemic, I've lost my job. Will I give access to my photo gallery? Most likely I will. Right. So I think when I deal with financial inclusion and privacy, then the odds are the deck is not stacked up evenly, because there is always this person who needs to access something. And therefore, to your question on, are there a lot of dark patterns that kind of, influence people to give away more information than they would? There probably are, but not many of them are necessarily embedded in consent. I'm probably going to say something which is really provocative, but I think consent is the biggest dark pattern of them all, right? I mean, consent as it exists, it is not free, it is not a contract amongst equals. It does not give you complete information. It can be changed unilaterally. If we were to apply the lens of contracts to consent, it would fail tremendously, right? As the Australian Commission has seen in the past, and they have actually defected consent, saying that this is not a great contract because it needs, both parties need to have equal kind of power, and consent takes that away, right? So I don't think that consent really needs dark patterns. I think they're doing a great job of not giving full information anyway. Where we are seeing dark patterns are places where it's hard to, let's say, unsubscribe to a product. Or in the US, a case that really snowballed and came into a lot of limelight was this, where there was a payday lender, and the form was lengthy, and as we all know, like, those forms are never easy to go through. There was a small clause somewhere which was pre-checked, and that clause said that I don't want to settle this loan, I want to extend the loan cycle, right? So what you meant was, when you were going into that loan with the opportunity, or with the probability that you haven't really read that tiny clause, and you will be auto-signed for an extension, and what you'll keep doing is keep paying interest out of your teeth, right? Because this is a payday loan. Typically, the kind of income segment that goes for payday loans are those who are not able to make ends meet with their daily income or with their salary, and therefore, payday loans, they are highly exorbitant. They're one of the most costly loans out there. And what this dark pattern then said was, it made it impossible for the person to sign out of that contract, out of that loan contract, obviously proving to be very expensive and disastrous for financial well-being of them and their family. And it was later taken up by the FTC. So these are the cases where we're seeing dark patterns. Until very recently, October, I think last year, if we were to book a flight on one of those travel portals, we would always get an insurance, travel insurance checked in. So you had to check out to say that, no, you had to opt out of it, that no, I don't need this travel insurance, for this short flight that I'm taking from Goa to Bombay, my luggage will be fine, it's okay. But in most cases, it was a pre-checked bundle that you got with your ticket. So that's the kind of dark pattern that we are seeing, pre-checked boxes, difficult to identify terms and clauses. And yes, I mean, the consent is by itself so hard and convoluted that I don't think we've come across dark patterns in consent by itself.
Got it. So one quick follow-up question before I go to Amber to take forward this conversation on regulation, right? So, okay, I hear you, consent is broken. There are certain harms that are arising that we may not necessarily have imagined earlier. The sight of these harms is, again, it's ever changing. Now, again, some of the work that you folks have done in the context of, larger data governance debates have been to talk about risk-based approaches to data governance, right? You've always said consent is broken, so on and so forth. Now, do you think that you could apply some of those same principles when you're thinking about regulating some of these new and emerging technologies, which are really, in a manner of speaking, the site of some of these body and data governance conversations that we're having, right? Whether it's the collection, use, storage of biometrics, whether it's the deployment of facial recognition technology by states, or by businesses alike. So what does effective regulation really look like, I think, is the question that I'm asking.
I think that it'd be remiss to kind of equate risk-based regulation with effective regulation, because risk-based regulation is like an educated compromise, because we know that we're not going to have enough state capacity and enough institutional bandwidth to go and regulate every person out there who has data. So what we do is we kind of filter through to see who are the biggest kind of carriers of data, collectors of data, and see if we can get them, if we can enforce the regulatory regime onto them pretty well and get a significant share of the market covered. So is risk-based regulation the best approach? No, but it's probably the best that we have. In case of dark patterns, I think, or even generally in case of just data regulation for, risk-based regulation for data, I think there are a couple of indicators out there that's already been done. It's an old work of ours which has been published out there. It kind of goes into, is the platform or the data collecting entity substitutable? Which is to say that if they're not substitutable, then it triggers all kinds of concerns, not only for data protection, but also for competition. knowing network effects, knowing externalities that operate. So you're quickly to become unsubstitutable. And then if something goes wrong with your data, you're basically putting a lot of people's life at risk. So there are some imperfect variables that one could always imagine. But I think the best approach would be to limit collection, as it were, because once the collection has happened, it's a toxic acid, like Nikhil was saying, it gets very hard to manage. One small example that I'll just want to give and wrap up. There's a lot of kind of conversation around having modular consent, which is to say that the person at the time of consenting can say that out of the 5 data points that you're collecting from me, I'm okay with just 3 being collected and 2 you should not collect. And at the time of consent, that information is well recorded. Our providers tell us that the biggest kind of challenge is to make that information trickle through your system and say that for this one particular person, you are not supposed to use this particular data set. How do you educate all your automated systems out there to say that this person has expressed an explicit kind of reservation in sharing or using this data point, right? So I think that once you collect, it gets a lot harder. The easiest way to also enforce would be to have more mindful collection practices as opposed to ex post, because we know technology is not perfect. There are not many ways in which you can actually enforce purpose limitation, in which you can actually enforce use limitation. So yeah, risk-based is when you don't have anything else, then out of everything you do risk-based. But I think we need to be smarter here.
Awesome. With that, Amber, I will come to you. Vinny's proposition is, hey, limit collection. I think we're doing anything but when it comes to conversations around, data that our bodies generate or data that can be inferred inferred from our bodies through, even in India particularly, and even around the world, through large state-sanctioned programs as well, right? So, and I think all of this also tends to go for a little bit of a toss when you have a very real, very live emergency that's staring at you in the face, which is also what we saw in the response of several governments really to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a question that I know you folks looked at as well at CIS, right? So we've seen the rise, I think, around the world of several governments looking at, in particular, say, facial recognition technology, a whole bunch of other, I think, data points that you could associate with bodies and our data. So where, again, in a situation like this, it's really the same question, right? Like what are some of the standards that you look at for some of these questions that we're asking, collection, use? How does this really play out in a state of emergency in particular? That's the first sort of question that I have for you. And the second question that I have, which is actually something that that I feel maybe you can use that as a choose to respond to it how you will. Do you think that there are limitations that are associated with looking at some of these issues from a rights-based perspective? And do you think the jurisprudence has actually kept pace accordingly with the different ways in which different governments around the world and private organizations around the world are interacting with different kinds of bodily data or biometric information? And our privacy jurisprudence in India, for example, is very much rights-based, right? You have a fundamental right to privacy and everything else sort of flows from there. So if I were to argue that that's a flawed way of looking at it, what would be your response to that? Also, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Neha. Hello, everyone. My name is Amber Sinha. I work at the Center for Internet and Society. Just kind of taking off from where Anya and Benny left off, I think just to very quickly maybe take a minute to contextualize the centrality of body in the entirety of discourse on privacy protection. If we look at privacy essentially as responding to technological innovation which threatens it, the body has always been the site of that contestation, right? So whether it's the evolution, whether it's the introduction of point and shoot Eastman Kodak cameras that led to the famous 1890 Harvard Law Review article by Warren Brandeis, or if we talk about the mid 20th century jurisprudence, which talked about, regardless of whether you're in your home or whether at a telephone booth, communication surveillance doesn't really rest in places, but it rests in, so privacy doesn't rest in places, but it rests in persons. Or if we look, a couple of decades later, to the whole idea of, grounding privacy in decisional autonomy, as more and more, in large parts of the world, we've come to understand it. There, again, it had to do with the idea, with the sort of contestation over a woman's body, the woman's right to choose, whether it's in the US in Roe v. Wade, or in India in the famous sort of High Court judgment in T. Sarita, which had to do with restitution of conjugal rights. So I think what we see largely over a period of time as privacy responding to some of these phenomena. And when you speak of state of emergency, or as what we witnessed in the last year and a half, some kind of public health emergency, at various degrees in different parts of the world. There is obviously, I think what we see more and more is, aside from the surveillance agenda of the state, which was seen as the primary sort of threat to privacy through a large part of the 20th century, what we also see is the welfare agenda of the state as a threat to privacy. And again, the sort of contestations between, what are seen as civil and political rights and what are seen as social and economic rights, and the false sort of trade-off that is often drawn between them. So I think when we speak of emergency, what we have to first recognize is that some of these principles are fundamental. If we have a fundamental right to privacy, then it can only be violated when the restrictions are reasonable. And the conditions of reasonableness are also fairly well established through that jurisprudence. So a state of emergency has to also be defined strictly within the limits of those reasonableness. And what we do see is essentially states, along with private parties, along with sort of big tech companies, looking to acquire more and more data, and often taking steps during emergencies which become irreversible. So if it has to actually be seen as a reasonable restriction on right to privacy, then it has to be the least intrusive restriction to the extent that it can achieve the objective in place, and then it has to be for a limited time period. So when the fact that we have a public health emergency doesn't mean that we need to think differently about fundamental rights. It means that perhaps there are newer circumstances which might introduce newer restrictions, which again need to be evaluated and measured by the same standard of reasonableness and necessity and proportionality. So I think that the answer to that lies very much in the established jurisprudence on this. And kind of going back to your question on the limitations of rights-based protection, I think the key challenge that we face is we live in a world where, like you said, a lot of our protections go back to fundamental rights. Sometimes, in a country like India or in a country like US, they're only available to us against the state. They're not available to us against private actors. And that itself, I think, more and more in the world that we live in is a limiting factor. And then I think the idea of rights is so intrinsically dependent on somebody being an informed self. For us to be able to understand our rights and then to be able to actually exercise them means that there is at least some minimum level of information that we require about the world that we're dealing with. And I think what we see as the big challenge with some of the more emergent technologies, when we talk of big data, or when we talk of particular kinds of machine learning processing, or even, nothing quite so fancy, the dark patterns that Benny was talking about, what they do pose is a fundamental challenge to this idea of the informed self. There are complicated systems that we deal with, and we no longer often tend to have a conceptual model of the world around us. So to give you an example, if we look at, we've always dealt with machines and we've never as a layperson, one doesn't truly understand the machines that we work with. So if I drive a car, I don't need to understand the nitty-gritties of, how every time I press on the accelerator, what exactly happens in the machinery of the car, but I need to have a conceptual model of how it works. If I press the brake, this will happen. If I press the accelerator, this will happen. If the engine is making this noise, maybe something is wrong with this part of the car. And that conceptual model is enough for us to make sense of it, to work with it in our daily lives. What goes wrong is when we're not able to even comprehend the extent of what we're dealing with. So when you have
what role, sorry, so then what role, last question before I hand over to Mark now, what is the role that the law has to play in amidst all of this tension?
So I think there are multiple levers of intervention.
Like data governance law, not like...
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The data governance law has to look at multiple levers of intervention, right? So the kind of, for instance, privacy policies and terms and conditions that Beni was talking about, these are one-sided, non-negotiable contracts which are best described, even in law, as unconscionable. So I think at that, the first intervention has to be at that level, that there needs to be some scope for negotiation, whether it is through modular or granular consent. And if you are looking at providing more agency to users, that cannot be in the form of a dump, right? So there is, and a lot of it is not rocket science. There are, I think that there is a fair bit of literature which talks about the format in which people can consume information in the easiest fashion. In a country like India, obviously there are multiple levels of challenges in terms of language, in terms of digital literacy, in terms of also the kind of devices that you're using and how you'll access that information. But I do feel that there is, I think, enough that we have to work with in terms of being able to provide that conceptual model in the form of a privacy policy or a privacy notice to an individual. And there is absolutely no incentive or right now for companies to actually invest in that. So regulators need to create situations where service providers are compelled to invest in this, and then also provide guidance on them over a period of time. We will not move immediately from a state of abysmal data practices to something that is more robust. So there has to be, I think, a hands-on role that, you talk about data governance, the data protection authority would have to play in this sense. And if we have to realize the sort of promise of informed consent, then I think we have to work towards that. And just a small point on the kind of risk-based regulation that Beni was talking about. There is a role for risk assessment and impact assessment in all of this, and perhaps the most important role is in trying to identify what might be the most harmful practices, as opposed to most harmful players, most harmful practices, and then perhaps more granular and more aggressive regulation dealing with those. So we have to look at it incrementally, both in terms of increasing the agency and realizing the sort of promise of informed consent. And at the same time, perhaps we need, particularly with regard to what are proven exploitative practices, some more paternalistic measures from the state as well.
Thanks, Amber. Mark, I'll bring you in here. Just to follow up on some of the themes that Amber was talking about. I think you've been looking at the impact of automated systems on monitoring, surveillance, data collection for a while now, particularly in the Australian context. So I'd be really curious to hear, how do you think these processes relate to the embodied forms of data collection and data collection about bodies? That's sort of a wider framing. And in particular, if I could also just stick with this theme of COVID-19, for a minute. And really the Australian government's response to this, I think, has also been to use facial recognition technologies amongst other kinds of data that we've been talking about as it relates to our bodies, to enforce a whole manner of restrictions, including quarantine restrictions, as well as now I imagine in sort of economic recovery, right, or questions of service delivery, even healthcare delivery through the pandemic, and sort of later as well. So yeah, can you, through all of this, right, so in the COVID specific context and outside of it as well, can you talk to us really what a little bit about what your research or writing has demonstrated?
Thank you so much, and huge thanks to MediaNama and the organizers for bringing me into this conversation. I'm really delighted to be part of it and to be in conversation with such an interesting group of folks. My name is Mark Andrejevich. I'm a professor in the School of Media, Film and Journalism at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. So I come at some of these questions from more of a media studies perspective and less of a legal perspective, although I like to think or hope that some of the contributions speak to questions that have to do with thinking with conversations about regulation and response to the forms of surveillance that are taking place. To pick up on your specific question about the COVID response in Australia, one of the biometric level responses that's received a fair amount of attention is what you've described in a couple of states, most notably recently South Australia. Folks who have to engage in self-quarantine or self-isolation are given the option in some cases to use automated systems that monitor whether or not they are staying at home. And how those work, they combine location-based monitoring with biometric detection. So rather than having police stop by at random intervals to one's home to see if one is self-isolating, one gets a phone call, and that phone call is on a smartphone which identifies one's location, but you've got to prove that you're the one who's with the phone, and the way you do it is by providing a photo of yourself in real time. And one of the interesting things that's going on there is that it seems, I don't know for sure if this is the case, but I can't figure out how else it's working, that this capability is accessing a nationwide database that has been assembled, but the enabling legislation for using it hasn't yet been passed. So it seems to be a case where the emergency conditions, quote unquote, of the pandemic are making it possible to access this information in ways that anticipate potential future uses, but haven't yet been encoded. And that's a pretty typical case in many scenarios of the way in which regulation isn't stopping or hasn't been constructed enough to stop a whole range of possible uses of biometric information. From the perspective of the work that I'm doing, much of my focus has been on facial recognition technology, in part because I'm really interested in the passive at a distance capability of being able to identify and make inferences. And I'll say something about that distinction in a second, but one of the things that I wanted to point to when it comes to thinking about embodied forms of data, or the relationship between data and embodiment, is the construction of infrastructures that increasingly treat bodies as interfaces, picking up on Anya's arguments about bodies as data. And here I'm thinking about the technologies that get the most attention, like remote biometrics, gait recognition, facial recognition, temperature recognition at a distance, technologies that have, some of which have come to the fore in the COVID context, but also infrastructures that come closer to the body or that come into private spaces, such as smart speakers, smart watches that dwell on the body and can collect body information, but also all those interfaces that we use in one way or another that can double as sensor apparatuses. So an interesting example you may have seen is there's some researchers who claim to be able to identify signs of early onset Parkinson's disease by how people use their mouse on a computer. Of course, we've heard about the ability to identify individuals uniquely based on typing patterns. What we might think of as biometric identification, biometric data is actually expanding as these capabilities for data detection and as the interfaces themselves expand. So, is how we use a mouse biometric data? Well, yes, it can be in particular contexts. When this takes place, when these sensor systems become interfaces, a couple of things that I think are really important take place. One of them is, in many cases, this is what we might call silent or passive data collection. We don't even realize that this data collection is happening. The other is that it becomes increasingly possible to, or the distinction between identification and inference becomes blurred. Systems that may be used for identification can also be doubled for inferential purposes. So, you may have seen these examples of facial recognition technology being used not just to identify individuals, but to make inferences about their emotional states, their intentional states, even inherent tendencies or allegedly inherent tendencies. So some folks have claimed to be able to use facial recognition to identify sexual orientation, criminal tendencies. All of this kind of inferential use, which seems quite, far-fetched and an attempt to resuscitate long debunked ways of thinking about how bodies work, are being explored and built into these systems. And much of the legislation that I've seen has really focused on identificatory uses. I think it's going to be very important to think about these inferential uses and how they can be used for new forms of social sorting and discrimination. The other aspect of the pandemic, which I think has been quite telling, is the way in which bodies become carriers of borders. And this is not necessarily a new development, but it's one that is, I think, being accelerated by some of the responses to COVID. And an example that I would bring into play here is some of the discussion that's emerging around so-called vaccine passports, and the idea that that could actually be linked to biometric forms of identification, which in turn can be used to access biometric data about one's vaccine status. And the ability to then use that as a means of creating a whole new set of, in some cases, automated borders. Can you come into this shop? Can you enter this airport? Will you be able to travel? All being decided based on checkpoints that multiply across the environment to capture this data as you move through it. So instead of what we think of as maybe discrete border points, a kind of ongoing engagement with different monitoring systems that decide questions of access and maybe preferential treatment or discriminatory treatment, forms of social sorting. I thought I would just conclude by, so I've kind of covered a range of possible ways of thinking about data and bodies. I'd say in terms of regulatory response, I think it's going to be very important not just to think about identification uses, but inferential uses and how that's encompassed by how we're talking about issues of privacy. And the second is to not just think about public space, but think about all of the spaces in which this type of data collection takes place without our knowledge or awareness. And automation makes that form of data collection very powerful. And I would close by just saying one thing about the discussion of consent. The former Human Rights Commissioner in Australia used an analogy which I think is a useful one when he was talking about human rights and privacy and data collection and logics of consent. And the analogy is this: when you enter a building, you are not required to look at all of the building inspection notices and check out, what the conditions of the various inspections are and whether or not these have been legitimately followed according to code in order for you then to consent to enter that building. Instead, the construction itself, one of the ways in which society functions is by constructing buildings in ways that there are systems in place to ensure that the thing won't fall down on you when you go in, so that you don't have to do the work of discerning whether or not that's been done accurately, and then informing yourself to give yourself the ability to decide whether or not you want to enter that building. I think consent is super important. And I really connect with the claim that autonomy is relational, and that when you talk about consent, you're talking about power relations. I also think that there are contexts in which consent can be too narrowly constrained to a kind of individual model, when we're really talking in many cases about large-scale social consequences in which we want to build social structures that don't necessarily come to rest on logics of consent, but that we've already built our priorities into how we want those things constructed, so that when we enter them, we know that they are meant to be following those rules. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Mark. Jalak, I'll come to you, and we'll actually use one of the things that Mark just said as a prompt, right? This question of who really should be doing the work, whose sort of responsibility is it? In some of your recent writing that you've done on AI, where you've looked at really what are some of the regulatory challenges that that we really need to consider when we're having conversations like this. You've argued that there needs to be the creation of an effective framework to address some of these regulatory challenges that arise out of the deployment of AI. Right now, if I were to zoom in a little bit and sort of contextualize AI to these conversations that we're having today, facial recognition technologies, or even some of the examples that Mark was giving us earlier about passive data collection, the inferences that you're drawing as a result of such kind of data collection, so on and so forth, right? So then, again, how do you think about regulation in this context? Do you believe that the development of all of such technologies that we're talking about, or the deployment of such technologies, requires also the simultaneous development of regulatory frameworks? So that's sort of a broader sort of question, right? And the second question, which is a little bit zoomed in, is do you think that we need to regulate different kinds of technologies and different kinds of applications differentially? Now, the side of that difference could be the actor, it could be the state versus the private sector, it could be the use case of this particular technology in question. So should there be some kind of differential regulation? And is there, do you think, inherently a greater risk in certain situations than others? And how do you sort of go about beginning to decide where is there a greater risk or where is there a lesser risk?
Thanks, Neha. So I think you've raised an important sort of question. I think a lot of our discussion till now has been focused on, data governance questions in the context of data and bodies, which are, of course, very fundamental questions to deal with. But I think there's a larger systems design question over here as well, around the very systems that sort of collect this kind of data, right? And I think, artificial intelligence and machine learning systems are, increasingly being deployed. And, as all of us have sort of been talking about on this panel, facial recognition technologies being, one of the key ways we see this kind of deployment and the sort of impacts it has on our privacy and society at large. And yes, I do think we need to be talking about regulation and designing effective regulation from now, because MediaNama has done a fantastic job over the last few years reporting on the deployment of facial recognition technologies in various different ways. I mean, we have, government PSUs deploying it for, attendance purposes. We have facial recognition technologies being deployed at airports and railway stations. We have facial recognition technologies being deployed in schools, in government schools in Delhi. And they've been reporting on the various ways and instances. And some of these are public spaces, some of these are private spaces, workspaces, educational spaces. And all of these have different levels of sensitivity and risk that they bring with them in terms of the impact it has not only on individuals, but mindsets and then democracy at large, right? So I think it is very, very crucial to be looking at designing optimal regulatory frameworks to effectively regulate these systems. And it's data protection frameworks, around questions of consent, processing of this data, how long this data is stored for. It's questions of, okay, even if this data is stored, because, a lot of these companies that design these systems want to store this data to use the data to, sort of train their systems further. So if it's being stored as anonymized data, anonymized and de-identified data can, be re-identified and has significant privacy implications, and then the broader impacts on society. I think in particular with AI systems, one of the challenges which needs to be addressed by regulation, and it's sort of a question that's still being debated, is AI systems raise a lot of questions of discrimination and bias, and we see that in a heightened manner in the deployment of facial recognition technologies. And bias creeps into AI systems in many different ways, right? We use bias training data sets or flawed sampling, which over or underrepresents minority communities. And then AI systems make decisions based on their training on these data sets, which sort of perpetuate and really embed historical bias and discrimination into our society. So I think we have to look at ways to tackle these problems, and these are broader questions for our regulators and our legislators to engage with. And I'll just, just another point related to questions of bias and marginalization and discrimination is marginal and vulnerable communities have traditionally been at the edges and margins of data collection and digital inclusion. And very often use of AI systems tends to further marginalize them and, enhances questions of inequity and inequality in our society, right? So I think regulation does need to be thinking about these broader societal impacts. And I think the third point I would raise over here is, in questions like regulation of AI systems, context really matters. And AI systems are being developed in the Western world and very often just being translated fairly blindly into other contexts, right? They're being translated from high resource context to low resource context. They're being translated from contexts where they're trained on particular kinds of data sets, maybe Caucasians or Black or Latino, faces, to being, trained to being deployed in an Indian context where we have such a diverse sort of, society with many ethnic groups. So I think these are all sort of regulatory questions to think about. In terms of the need for differential regulation and like questions of where there's greater risk involved, I think there is, of course, a need for differential regulation, and there are many situations where sort of greater risk is involved. And I'll take the example of children's data, right? So earlier this year, the Delhi government has talked about and has actually deployed sort of facial recognition systems in about a dozen government schools in Delhi. And, this is sort of followed from the move to install CCTV cameras across government schools in Delhi and more than 700 public schools. So we're probably going to see FRT rolled out, slowly over a period of time, over a fairly large volume of schools. And what's worrying is this is like collection of children's data, and what are the sort of privacy mechanisms in place? What is consent over here? Are you going to take consent from parents? Is that really meaningful? Do they have an option to opt out? What are they not going to send their children to the school because government schools are now, we're talking about government schools, right? Like anyways, in our society, people who are accessing government schools are accessing them because of questions of, probably inequity and lack of access to other educational facilities. So, I mean, what is meaningful consent in this context? And, what is, and there are significant implications to the use of children's data on their privacy, on their safety, on their security. And it not only has an implication on their privacy, it has profound impacts on their effect to their ability to develop and, different, we're sort of, facial recognition technologies in the context of schools are now being used to check which students are focusing, to evaluate them. And then we are, relying on emotions and, as Mark was talking about, for inferential purposes, right? And then we are sort of standardizing and homogenizing our society and saying, okay, this is what a neurotypical child sort of comes across as when they are looking focused in classrooms, and we sort of start benchmarking all children against them, and that has sort of detrimental effects in terms of the sort of society we are trying to build over here. And third, it just amplifies inequities in our sort of school system. It leads to marginalization of certain groups, already vulnerable groups within our society. And I think I'm going to stop with the last point, is that studies have shown that children as young as the age of, I think, 1.5 years, start modifying their behavior when they realize they're being watched. Okay. So, I mean, can you imagine what impact this is going to have on a child's psyche growing up, school where they spend a large amount of their day, and what impact is this going to have in terms of how we're going to develop as human beings, notions of autonomy, and beyond privacy, beyond autonomy, like our ability to function as human beings in the society. And we're going to be monitoring them in a place where they learn, and that's just going to undermine setting a strong foundation for a free and democratic society. So I'm sort of going to stop here, but yes, we do need to really think about regulation and differential risk assessments for different contexts.
Thank you, Jalak. That's quite a powerful note to end on. I will also pause here. I have a lot of follow-up questions for you, but I feel like at this point I will get into great trouble with MediaNama if I do not open this up for questions. Nikhil, I will hand over to you for the first question. To Jalak specifically, if you have one, because she needs to leave in 5 minutes. So if you have any questions for Jalak, go ahead. Otherwise, for any of the other panelists.
Thanks, Neha. Jalak, that, like Neha said, that's a really, really powerful sort of explanation of what's going on. And when you talk about the impact on lives and democracies, it sort of hits home for me as well. I mean, that's something that I deeply care about. I'm just curious about what you think should be next steps, and what kind of regulation would you like to see? What kind of limitations would you like to see in terms of data collection, and also drawing inferences in the manner that you suggested? And do you see a differential regulation for children and a differential approach to regulation for adults, or do you think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach here?
I think honestly, at this stage, we kind of need to press pause, and we really need to take stock of what's happening. I think globally, we are seeing regulators and countries, regional sort of coalitions of countries, really saying, let's hit pause over here and let's understand what these technologies are doing, how we can best regulate them. I think people still don't have answers on how we can best regulate these technologies. And I think let's acknowledge that and not try to say that we have all the answers. Let's press pause and understand, okay, we have all these countries globally, Western societies that are pressing pause, that are seriously giving thought to what they want to do. Really saying, let's maybe learn from some of the thinking they're doing, but ours is also a very different society. We come from a global South context. We have different challenges in our society. So I think we do need to really think independently in our
I'm going to push you still on that, because I don't think ours is a society that's likely to press pause right now.
Yeah.
And so let's say if, what would you like to see happening, let's say from a parent's perspective or from a citizen's perspective? Because I don't think we're going, given that most of the facial recognition reporting that we've done over the last year has been related to government tenders, and the systems that are being deployed, including a report last year on PCR vans patrolling the streets of Delhi, wanting to deploy facial recognition systems. And we did this crazy one on the Lucknow Safe City tender, where they wanted to draw in. There were 42 different instances that they wanted to be able to judge just based on behavior on camera. So I'm just thinking about what is it that you see as initial steps or basic steps for limiting things if the government doesn't press pause.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge that we also think about a lot, Nikhil, very honestly, because the problem is the way the data protection bill is currently structured. There's a wide arena of exemption that the government can sort of grant itself, right, for law enforcement purposes. And maybe some of that can be read even more broadly for a lot of the other applications that they're looking and have already sort of rolled out. So I really don't know, and we're going to see a reformulated version of the PDP bill potentially coming out. So I don't really know what more we can do at this stage, besides, continuing to iterate the need for government oversight, the need for sort of a legislation that underpins the use of such technologies by government. Because if we go back to the Puttaswamy judgment, right, I mean, the sort of the first prong is the fact that there needs to be a legal basis, right? And typically these kind of technologies in the Indian context have sort of worked on SOPs, which are not even usually in the public domain. So I think one of the first things I'd really like to see is sort of actually legislation that is in the public domain, to which I can hold the government accountable and understand sort of what storage processes are they using, how long are they, maintaining my data for, like what kind of processing is the data being subject to, how is this data being shared with other systems, and what sort of 360-degree view is the government creating around citizens. So I think that's one. The second thing is I'd like to see more transparency around government acquisition of such technology, right? We've seen the government, over the last couple of years, repeatedly, I think 11 or 12 times, they extended the deadline on the acquisition of the facial recognition system that they were sort of trying to procure. There hasn't been a lot of information in the public domain post that on what has really happened. So I'd like to see more transparency and accountability around the government acquisition of such technology. Because unless we can understand what technology the government is acquiring, we don't even know what sort of to underline and highlight as the potential challenges that we can be seeing. And I think third, what I'd really like to see is, we're going to have this PDP bill that's reformulated by the JPC. I really wonder if civil society and interested stakeholders are going to have a chance to really come to the table and give their perspective and push back against some of the thinking that may emerge in a new version of the bill, and especially if provisions that are relevant to such concerns are further diluted, because typically at this stage in the process there are limited points of intervention. And it seems to be that interests that are aligned with sort of certain perspectives will get a say on the table, but perhaps civil society will not have those avenues available to come to the table.
Benny, solutions?
Wow, if I knew. Okay, I'm going to take a crack at it anyway. I think that I feel a little bit more optimistic thinking of solutions on the private sector side, which is to say that the government is a whole another can of worms. But for private sector side, I do think that the best thing that regulation can do is make privacy how do I say it? Make a market out of privacy, which is to say that make privacy a parameter on which private providers kind of compete. There's always been this question of, does the market exist? Does the willingness exist? A lot of our work has uncovered that people really dearly care about privacy. I'm not saying that therefore they should be paid for it, but I'm saying that privacy protecting strategies are not as far from the ground, or they're not very hard to understand when broken down clearly. And therefore the privacy competitive edge is something that we need to kind of activate a little bit more and talk about a little bit more in our practices. I think the direct onus then goes to impact investors, where, whatever matrix they have of impact, privacy should actually figure quite vehemently in that one, to say that this is something I'm going to measure against. So there's a little bit of an ecosystem approach. And
I don't know, Benny, when I think about, for example, when you're entering a housing society in India, you can refuse to get your face scanned and someone will come and get you in. But if you're a food delivery worker or a gig economy worker wanting to enter, the company that you're working with already has a partnership with that gateway monitoring software that the housing society has, and they use the data you've given to your, well, not employer technically, but to the company that you're providing these services to, and they've integrated with the the gated community entrance software provider, and that does a facial recognition to let you in. So there's also a sense of I would say socioeconomic classism that's come into even the deployment of the software from the private ecosystem side. And they are also, especially post-COVID, they're not, I think this is being pitched as one mechanism for even employee attendance, where they don't have to put their fingerprint somewhere. Can we really expect anything from the private sector here?
So I think that, okay, I've just walked myself into it, haven't I? Quickly, the private sector that I was referring to was more limited, more organized, in the sense of, where the stakeholders are kind of readily identifiable. So let's say the financial inclusion community, where we've seen some of these steps at the Responsible Finance Forum, where privacy is now becoming an impact investment indicator, so on and so forth. To the question that you have put forth, that private sector by large is like, it's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. And I completely hear you on the point of class distinction in privacy, which unfortunately is not new, right? I mean, we've had people in power say that privacy is not a right for the poor. So honestly, I'm not surprised. But I think the point there is, we need to break down the constitutional, and I'm not a lawyer, so actually it's less of a suggestion and more of a question, that I do think where I see the whole confusion coming from is really the interpretation of Puttaswamy itself, the privacy judgment, where there seems to be the three-pronged test laid out, but nobody seems to be applying it. So is there something in between which is missing, that this is the constitutional wisdom, but what does the person on the ground who wants to run a business take away from it, right? How do they apply it? How do they internalize it? I think that's the bit that we are missing. It's a little bit like the crisis of environment, that nobody knows how to quantify it. How do you place it as a constraint, and therefore you're just going on abusing it? So I think that kind of configuration needs to happen, where you practice the privacy judgment, and there needs to be frameworks which guide industry to say that, this is how you make the three-pronged test. I think, to me, that's a crucial component.
Thanks, Penny. Mark's safeguards.
I think some of the proposals that have been put forth, for example, on the EU proposal for regulation of biometrics, that would require impact assessments for the use of the technology, for particularly they're interested in one-to-many forms of identification, and that would dramatically restrict their usage to some very defined applications. I think that's, as a regulatory move, that's probably a good one. But your deeper question, I think, is the important one, which is, which states will have the will to implement that? And I'm not really optimistic. It's when it comes to that, based on some past experience. I do think, because I don't see any other way, that public education and public literacy and awareness super important, especially when it comes to anticipating future uses, because what we've seen in the past is certain promises of efficiency and convenience and access can carry a lot of weight against the background of future harms. And if we can anticipate those future harms and tell those stories and make them clear, it maybe lessens the appeal of the convenience and the efficiency and so on, and security that's promised by these technologies. To bring in current events, to watch Facebook recently face the kind of consequences that were readily discernible by and predicted by many folks.
Consequences. We haven't seen any consequences yet.
Sorry, not consequences. Well, public.
We
public,
hope to see, but
yeah, we hope. But public censure, maybe, or I'm not sure how to best describe it. But that what it's doing and the harms that are revealed, those were anticipatable. They could have been, framed early on. And I think the same is true of these technologies that we're talking about. Thank you for the work that you're doing, because that's one of the places that I think is crucially important. If you're going to get governments to respond, you need, the popular will. You need some public pressure to make that happen. And I don't really see any other way except for telling those stories and anticipating those concerns and amplifying the voices that are speaking about them.
So, just 1 minute, Nikhil, because this was actually something I wanted to ask Mark about earlier. Are you optimistic that will actually happen? I think you've written about this a little bit, right? Like public awareness leading to political consensus and political will is necessary. And one of the ways to sort of get to that is, public awareness and conversation. So are you optimistic? Is that going to happen?
The best I can come up with is the Gramsci response, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. If you look at it, it doesn't look very likely. But it is possible that the type of tech backlash that we've been seeing recently, combined with the type of research that's taking place and the type of journalism that's taking place, you've got to hope that possibility exists. We want to create particular types of societies that we want to live in, and we don't want to find ourselves in some type of dystopia. So I'm not optimistic intellectually, but optimism of the will. Yeah.
But I just hope that it won't take for someone to get hurt really badly for there to be change legally. But I'm going to now ask the two lawyers, and Neha, you're also up for that. Legal solutions, like what are the legal safeguards that we can bring in here? And do you think that, just to again go back to an India focus, do you think that the personal data protection bill, the draft that we've all seen, provides adequate protection? Because I don't think we'll probably see a separate law for biometric data coming in anytime soon. And of course, there is the DNA data bill as well, just to remind you, and to just echo a point that Liam Bhushan has made in the Q&A thing, that have you considered going beyond the human body and to the DNA? DNA data violates your privacy and the privacy of your of your descendants without your knowledge and consent. Even if a third cousin shares their data, do you choose, I consent to my privacy being violated before I choose to be born as a descendant? But just to legal solutions, Amber and Neha, do you see the data protection bill as sufficient? What do you think can be done to address all of these concerns related to data related to bodies? Amber?
I see two kinds of problems here, largely. The first kind of problem is the kinds of things that we're seeing. So, for instance, all the facial recognition related developments that we're seeing. So, to kind of go back to what Benny ended with, we have the Puttaswamy judgment. We have a very clear legal standard, a three-part legal standard in it, and that is the law. As of now, as of 2017, that is the law. What we see are blatant and flagrant violations of that law. across the board. Because there is no system to hold the state accountable, a lot of executive actions are done without any legislative oversight, and there is minimal judicial review that we're seeing. So we are stuck in a position where we have a truly epochal judgment and a fairly well-established judicial standard, which is not really being followed. The second kinds of problems, so these are not, the answers to these questions are clear. We have, ways of dealing with this problem. It's just that there doesn't seem to be any political will or, will or power with other stakeholders to actually address it. The second kind of problem are the more complicated problems that we were talking about earlier. How do you solve the problem of regulatory capacity? How do you, get to informed consent? What sort of systems do you put in place? How do you think of it from those? So those are going to take time, and those are going to require, discussions like these, scholarship, and they're going to require experiments. But I think
just to cut you short, if you had to tell the JPC something, what would you tell them about this?
I think they need to give the DPA a long leash. And the second thing that they need to do is they need to really come down on the kind of state powers that we see in the latest draft. Essentially, what this draft does is it takes power away from private sector and gives it to the government in a wholesome fashion. That needs to change.
Neha?
Yeah, so I think whether or not the latest draft bill will be effective, to me, would be a context-specific answer. I think it's woefully inadequate when it comes to the state's use of any of these technologies. The point that Ambar was making earlier as well. I do think that I would love to see. I mean, if I'm being idealistic, I would love to see the question that Benny was talking about, right? Like, really, what does necessary and proportionate mean? I'd love to see legislation really lay out some kind of criteria for really how fundamental rights would be operationalized in practice. But when it comes to the private sector, private sector's use of these technologies, I think the principles really that you're expecting from privacy legislation, I think most of them are there. It's really going to come down to operationalizing and seeing how all of this plays out on a case-to-case basis.
Well, I don't think we have many significant solutions available to us yet. But thank you so much, and thank you for some amazing moderation, Neha. I really appreciate all of you joining in. I don't think this is the end of this topic. We're probably going to have many conversations on this going forward, because this is a problem that looks like it's only going to expand from here on. But thank you so much for your insights, everyone. I'd like to now welcome Vrinda Bhandari, the chair, for the next session, and where we're going to look at the impact of privacy legislations on the openness of the internet, and look a little bit at data sovereignty and the push for that, and how that might impact. Well, all of that is being looked at with the lens of data as an economic asset. Privacy is, my sense is we're just playing lip service to privacy there. But how does this impact us communicating in this manner across the world, joining in from different parts? And we want to hear this particularly from the context of the BRICS economies. And we'd like to thank Luca and CyberBRICS for helping us put this together. Thank you so much, Luca, for all your help. Vrinda, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nikhil. And I'm super excited to be moderating the session of PrivacyNama on the impact of privacy legislation on the openness of the internet, which MediaNama is hosting in partnership with the CyberBRICS project. And as Nikhil mentioned, we'll be focusing on privacy legislation, the push for digital and data sovereignty in all the BRICS economies, and what impact this has on the global nature of the internet. We are super lucky today to have an absolutely fantastic panel. And I'm actually really excited to hear everybody's views. So we'll start with Dr. Luca Belli. So Luca is a PhD at the professor of and a professor of internet governance and regulation at the FGP Law School in Brazil, where he coordinates the Center for Technology and Society and heads the CyberBRICS project. Luca is also associated as a researcher at the Centre de Droit Public Compare of Paris University. He's a member of the board of the Alliance for Affordable Internet, and he serves as the director of the Latin American edition of the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference. Welcome, Luca. We also have Alexa Lee at the Information Technology Industry Council. So Alexa is a senior manager of global policy at the ITI Council, and she focuses on trust and data innovation issues. She's a non-resident fellow with Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, focused on technology and cyber policy. Lee is also an associate editor of New America Stanford University DigiChina Initiative, where she contributes analysis on Chinese ICT policies. She's also working as a co-chair for the IT Sector Coordinating Council's Cyber Threat Working Group, which works closely with the US Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Alexa. We also have Dr. Alison Gilwald of the Research ICT Africa, RIA. Alison is the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, an African digital policy and regulatory think tank that works across 20 African countries. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town's Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, where she supervises doctoral students undertaking research in digital policy, regulation, and data governance. She sits on the ITU Indicators Experts Group and is a UNESCO nominee to the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. She's the deputy chairperson of GigaNet, the only international academic conference dedicated to internet governance. She's currently co-leading the Data Justice Workstream of the Data Governance Working Group of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome, Alison. We also have Udbhav. So Udbhav Tiwari is a public policy advisor for Mozilla, where he primarily focuses on data governance, content regulation, and connectivity in the Asia-Pacific region. He is also a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, India. Udbhav was previously with the public policy team at Google and was a program manager at the Center for Internet and Society in India. Udbhav was a co-rapporteur at the International Standards Organization and participated actively at the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineer C work on ethically aligned design. Welcome to all the panelists. Super excited to have you here. So the way we'll be doing this is I will be asking each of you a series of questions, just some introductory questions to kick off with, and then we'll try and go into some thematic rounds. We will be leaving around half an hour at the end for audience questions and answers. So please do keep your questions coming on the chat box, and I will be putting them to the panelists at the end. So Alison, hi.
Sorry to interrupt the meeting and your very nice and generous introductions. I just wanted to say that I'm in discussion with Nikhil and Nishant earlier this week. I do have Andrew Renz here. Dr. Andrew Renz is our senior fellow and who has been working with me. I'm afraid I've made a terrible mess of my diary, and I've got a clash that's coming in and a clash that's coming out the other end. So I'll stick around as long as possible, but I've asked him to be prepared to make our intervention depending on the timing. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Andrew, welcome as well. Is Andrew here right now?
Yes, he is.
Oh, okay, great. So Andrew Wren is a senior research fellow at RIA Africa, and he's qualified as an attorney in South Africa. Andrew was awarded a doctoral degree from Duke University for research on the use of Creative Commons licenses for educational materials. He's taught law at the University of Witwatersrand, Cape Town, and Duke, and has conducted research at the American University in Washington and Stanford. His current research focuses on governance and regulation of emerging data-intensive technologies of AI and the Internet of Things. So we are really lucky to have both Alison and Andrew right now. So Alison, since you may be short on time, I'll start with you. South Africa has a data protection law, the Protection of Personal Information Act 2013, which has entered into force last year. But there are also some negotiations that are going on at the African Union level. Could you tell us a bit about what are some of the sticking points? What are some of the sticking points of this negotiation?
Thanks very much, Verinda. This is correct. We've had the PAPIA Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act, for several years now. It was operationalized in a very basic way that allowed for the establishment of the information regulator, and various other aspects of the law, but really only became operational this year. So, close to a decade that it's taken for this law to become operational, and largely because of the lobbying and the influence of the private sector around, this being onerous for them to comply. So actually, when we started the lockdown and COVID and the introduction of COVID regulations and data requirements for contact tracing, etc., and for registration of COVID, we had to actually have particular regulations around that, data regulations around that, to make it compliant with our constitution and the disaster management law. So we actually had a dedicated COVID judge, a head of the courts, etc. And then the information regulator, it sort of only came into play fully this year. Although the legislation was actually there to have operationalized that and got her to play that role. But there was actually, as I said, a very nice deference to our constitution and to the creation of a oversight judge to just make sure that this data was not used for purposes it wasn't intended, and these kinds of things. So in that sense, South Africa has enjoyed, considerably greater data protection than many other parts of the continent. We have had data protection and cybersecurity convention, the Malabo Convention, that is also several years old now. That again was approved by the African Union member states. But in fact, in terms of acceding to it, we've only had 12 countries accede to that, and we require 15 for it to become operational. So, we have a history of developing policy in line and kind of, in time with international leaders in this area, or international agreements in this area, but then the actual implementation on the ground is not always, quite as intended. The adoption is not there. Very often, the institutions, although they exist in law, are not established, or they are established without the necessary institutional capacity and, of course, the institutional autonomy that they require often to perform these functions in a way that protects individuals both from state surveillance, or illegitimate state surveillance, and of course, private surveillance as well. I think what's important about these developments is that over the last few years, but I think in a sense, Africa's lag in getting to some of this has also made it a bit of a leader in some ways, is that we've got the South African now looking at a data policy in South Africa that's under review at the moment and has had some critique and some input, but basically looking at data far more broadly than just data protection. And we are also working with the African Union on a data policy framework that has gone through a member state validation process and is going to the member states, the meeting of ministers shortly, next week, I think, for acceptance. That again, countries will accept this framework. Actually implementing it, the framework is basically a very high level principled, as I said, full data policy framework, so includes personal and non-personal data. And this, to what degree this will be effectively domesticated, time will tell. But in acknowledgement of the very diverse, I mean, we always speak about Latin America, or however many countries, 12 or 11, and MENA or so many, and then we just say Africa, and we're talking about 55 very, very different countries. Even if we divide them into their economic regions, 5 very diverse regions, and then of course major economies, etc. So very difficult to speak about the African continent, but certainly what the window of opportunity is here. And I don't want to make too much of a unrealistic hype about it, but I think what has been possible with this data policy framework is that it builds on the digital transformation strategy, which is really the Africa strategy, amongst other things, to support digital transformation on the continent, but particularly to get the digital transformation we need to realize the African Continental Free Trade Area. So there's a policy window here in getting states to realize that we can get kind of the levels of harmonization we need to create markets with the economies of scale and scope that one needs to build data value. I think what's important about the policy framework is that we've managed to or not we managed to, but what is in it now, and it's still there at the moment, is, it's a strong rights preserving framework. So that's very, clearly in the document, but also, it very much moves beyond simply a privacy and the notions of kind of individualized notions of privacy that you get in GDPR, etc. It's very much around, a framework to redress the uneven distribution of opportunities and harms created in this environment, and the kind of differential requirements you needed. So as I said, it's very much a high-level principle document so that countries can implement it kind of at the levels and the capacities that they have, with a common vision towards a data environment that would be, very enabling. And so, very strongly emphasized in this, which is often missing from these kind of fourth industrial revolution and, data economy kind of hype, immediate solution to all our economic problems, is saying that, we have to address the digital preconditions in order to, so we have to address digital inequality if we're going to create these data frameworks. And also, just the foundational requirements of that, the foundational infrastructure, the foundational data infrastructure in terms of warehouse, etc. And then, and of course, digital ID systems, and then of course this trusted framework that we have to create, beyond a cybersecurity and data framework, which is of course an enormous challenge on the continent, across the world, but on the continent too, in terms of very low levels of institutional trust. So that's the kind of really critical framework. And then there's a very detailed data governance section, which I'm sure Andrew will have a chance to speak to in more detail, but which, is essentially built around the concept of data control, that both to create openness and to create closeness, you actually have to, it's a matter of how the data is controlled. And so we look at the issues of data localization and data sovereignty as kind of two aspects of this control, within the context very much of realizing that, the data has no value in and of itself. So simply, adopting a very strong data sovereign position and a data localization position, which has been very strong across many states, and not unsurprisingly, considering the complete value extraction that we've seen from international companies through the World Trade Organization agreements and these kinds of things over decades. So it's not surprising that you have this response, but I think the way it's framed now, again, through the African Union common market, is that actually if we can let these flows happen between borders within the African context, we can create this value in the African context, but that it's also, there's a kind of reciprocity there, that one would be able to enjoy the same opportunities and benefits across these borders. But that's a very long answer to your question. Thank you so much.
No, that's really helpful. I'll just ask one quick follow-up question. And basically you spoke about the South Africa data policy framework, and you were mentioning that there have been some critiques and inputs. So if you could just give us a really short summary of what those critiques were. And connected to that, you also spoke about the AU data policy framework. And you said that it's gone to member states for acceptance. But at the same time, you mentioned that for the Malabo Convention, only 12 countries have signed up. So do you see a similar problem, like you said, of it's gone to all the member states? Will there be a similar problem in signing up like you've experienced previously with the Malabo Convention? And if not, why is this different at the AU level?
So I'm going to leave Andrew to take the South African data policy question, because I'm going to have to run. But I suppose my answer to the African Union question, after 20 years of banging one's head, watch the blood dripping down my forehead on these issues, is that if one was, adopted this kind of pessimistic view, which one's very entitled to, in terms of, we do everything, we get the policy, but then we don't actually implement it and see it through. As I said, basically as the technical assistance people for this project, and this has been our strategy over, 25 years of research to policy influence, is to take it a step at a time. I think this is all we can do in policy. A window of opportunity opens to support the African Union on this, get a progressive data policy in place. one has to take it through a task team process that's highly political. There are countries that are notoriously, traditionally conservative about these things, don't want things that we regard as really kind of parts of international universal declaration of rights and various things that have to be held onto. And the fact that you can get it through that task team and to a validation workshop. We did actually also manage to insert into the system a informal, because it couldn't be done officially through the AU, an informal consultative process. So we had civil society inputs, very, very valuable civil society inputs, very short time frames, all understandably critiqued for the inability to really kind of consult at in depth. But we did manage to do that. And so my sort of response to you is, yes, we do have a bad legacy. Hopefully we can get enough buy-in. Hopefully this doesn't all unravel at the ministers' meeting. And hopefully the political economy at the moment and the need for, COVID reconstruction and these kinds of things really lend themselves to people realizing the self-interest in having a enabling trusted framework in which to operate. And I'll let Andrew handle the South African data critique, which he was very much part of from our side.
So I'll just say that the one difference, I think, between the Malabo Convention and this continental-wide data policy is, of course, you don't have a valid, in international law, you don't have a valid treaty until you've had enough countries ratify. But if all the countries agree to the policy, well, it's sufficient countries so that it becomes African Union policy, then there's not a second barrier to countries beginning to implement. And it wouldn't be surprising, historically, if some countries implement very rapidly. Those that, particularly due to COVID, want to now, massively improve their ability to make use of digital technologies.
Yeah.
And so so COVID itself may make a difference, and then the fact that this just has to go through one hurdle. The treaty had to go through two. Firstly, everyone had to agree to the treaty, they signed it. And then it had to be ratified, which is the second step, before it comes into force. Whereas it's one hurdle now. Of course, we'll have to see if it gets through over that hurdle. But once it's done, we can then imagine that some countries will begin to implement very rapidly. And then others may may delay by a decade, but that doesn't stop the sort of front runners from engaging. So
that's actually,
Sorry,
I may come back to you on the South Africa specific question, maybe in the second round, because I think
because you want to move.
I think I'll because you've actually given a really important point on the difference of sort of ratification treaty, and both you and Alison have also talked about the importance of institutional trust in institutions, and I think that's actually a great segue to also LUCA. And in LUCA in Brazil, law 13.709 of Brazil, or the general law for the protection of personal data, which is called the LGPD, was sanctioned in 2018 and came into force in August 2021. So have there been any initial learnings and experience that you would like to share that you've seen that you think are useful?
Thank you very much, Vrinda, for this question. And thank you very much for all the MediaNama friends that organized this excellent session. I think it's very timely to have this discussion. Also, for all those countries that are either trying to implement or thinking about regulating personal data protection, I think it's very good to have the experience also of so-called developing countries or low-income or middle-income countries, because it is a very different experience from what you can have from Europe, where there are very different circumstances. It's not only a matter of money development, it's also a matter of having 50 years of data protection culture in Europe. The first law in Europe, the German law, the Hesse law, the Swedish law, the French law, they were all conceived in the 70s. So that means that Europe has been learning for 50 years what they want in terms of data protection, what is data protection and how to implement it. And still, it doesn't function well. So it's a very important preliminary consideration. When then we come into Brazil, or if we want to take a regional approach, because Latin America in general has been deeply influenced from the European model, not only because all countries are former colonies, but also because the need, or at least the perceived interest of having digital trade enhanced by having a similar approach to the European one, and so having adequacy in case of some Latin American countries, according to GDPR Article 45. This is a very good incentive. The main incentive for a lot of developing countries to adopt data protection law. Let's be pragmatic and honest, right? So that is also one of the driving incentives that has played out in Brazil, together with a lot of scandals, international scandals, and also some internal pressure. I think, again, also the fact that the previous government want to accede to the OECD and have something similar to the OECD recommendation on the guidelines of protection of personal data and free flow of data was a very strong reason for the previous government to then sign and sanction the law in 2018. Then we come to implementation, and Brazil has been dragging its feet for 2 years. Really, it has been postponed, the implementation, the creation of an agency. So the law was existing. So on the paper, Brazil had a law, a very nice authority like Europe, right? But then in practice, that was really far from the reality. And that is, I think, the main teaching I would like to share is that once it's already very difficult to have a consensus on a strong, solid law that still has a lot of points, major points that have to be implemented through regulation by an authority. It's already very difficult to create an authority, which is at the moment in Brazil is not an independent authority. Let's remind it, it's dependent directly to the office of the cabinet of the President of the Republic. So it's not an independent authority. It may become it after 2 years from the creation, so 2 years since the end of last year. But what we have now in Brazil is a potentially good law that still has to be implemented a lot through regulation, and the potentially good authority that still has to become an independent authority, and it is severely under-resourced. And this is also a key concern. The resources, not only financial resources, but also intellectual resources. The public servants that work there have started getting acquainted with personal data protection 1 year ago, or maybe a couple of years ago if they had personal interest in it. They are all seconded agents from other ministries and authorities, so it is very difficult to implement it and effectively when you have such huge challenges and so reduced resources. And that is, I mean, if we want to take the example of the BRICS country that we analyze at the Cyber BRICS project here at the Center for Technology and Society of FGV, if you take the example of China, for instance, the level of resources of the cyberspace administration of China is like 100 times superior to what we have here. And it's not only a matter of different size of population, is really a matter of understanding that if you want to regulate, you have to invest a lot of money into regulation.
I think you've raised some really interesting points, Luca, and I think things that we in India feel as strongly about in terms of implementation and regulators and the independence. And I think just sort of building on that, you know, you've spoken about some of these concerns, you've kind of hinted at them in terms of the independence and under-resourcing. So what would your recommendations be to ensure that implementation is effective? Because I think your recommendations would actually be applicable to many, many countries. So given what you've seen and how the law is and these concerns, what would your recommendations be for improving implementation of the regulator in Brazil?
You know what, we are now going to publish an upcoming research on good practice, because there is not only bad practice in the BRICS country, right? Yeah. There is also a lot of good practice and also a lot of innovative thinking, right? And because they are leading countries in their regions, and therefore they do not only copy, they also try to innovate. Something that from South Africa is, I think, a very good practice is the fact that there is an open process to select the board of the authority, and the public servants have to be chosen for their solid competence. That is, of course, it is possible also because the law was created 8 years ago, and it took 8 years to implement it. So there was time to select people. So that is, understandably, a different setting. But it is essential to have a very well-resourced regulator. It is the same in every sector. If you want to regulate, you have to have very good resources. both financial resources, so very good budget, and also intellectual resources. You need to have very well trained, not only lawyers, also what is now very evident, knowing that the majority of data are harvested at scale by digital corporations, but corporations that have digital businesses as their core business, that you also need data scientists, very well-trained data scientists, a technical team that is very well-trained, and it costs money, because if you don't pay well, these people, they go to work for Google and Facebook, right? So it's really a matter of understanding that if you want the regulation to work, you have to invest in it, and then it works well. If you do not invest in it, it's really useless.
Yeah, I think really great questions. I'd like to now move on to Alexa, and just speaking sort of about the importance of the culture of data protection that Luca also spoke about, and how long some countries have had from implementation. China is seeing a lot of interesting developments through the Chinese Personal Information Protection Law, the PIPL. So could you tell us a bit about how you think the PIPL will affect data flows and interoperability? And just what are some of your comments on some of the problems with the PIPL and some of the good and the bad, so to speak? Alexa?
Sure. Thank you, Vinda, and thank MediaNama for organizing this interesting discussion. Before I talk about China, I just want to say a few words about my organization, the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. ITI is the Global Industry Association for Technology based in Washington, D.C., representing 80 of the world's most innovative companies, with offices in Europe, China, India, and Brazil. Our diverse membership includes hardware, software, and related industries, and data protection is one of the top priorities for our members. So in my remarks, I will focus on China's Personal Information Protection Law, PIPL. So one big news in the privacy community in August is that the Chinese National People's Congress, NPC, they finally passed the PIPL, and the law will become effective in November. So this is a milestone in Chinese year-long effort to build a comprehensive privacy and data governance regime. The law will not only just shape privacy law in China, but also it could become a major force in the global privacy landscape for international stakeholders. However, there are 2 points to keep in mind when you are reading the PIPL. First, the PIPL is a framework law that is not intended to provide a lot of details like the GDPR. Rather, it sets out a broad principles, and more details will come through other technical specification. This is how Chinese legal system work. And second, while we are talking about privacy here, the concept of privacy is different in China. The law's focus is on protecting individual, society, and national security because of Chinese unique political system. So at a high level, China's PIPL represents a third way between the US sectorial approach and GDPR. So what do I mean by that? In my view, the PIPL is a significant step for the Chinese government's overall data governance strategy that try to balance data protection and technology advancement. The PIPL also represents China's evolving data governance regime that try to emphasize on consumer privacy, but at the same time, they have to prioritize national security. So that's why we see like data localization measures, cross-border data flows restrictions, and continued surveillance and law enforcement powers. So before I kind of dive into some of the details, I think it's worth mentioning some domestic context. So before the law was passed in August, China has relied on scattered provisions on personal information protection through various different measures under the framework of the cybersecurity law. And to kind of consolidate those efforts, China gradually built out some data privacy system through the Personal Information Security Specification, in May 2018, the same month the GDPR took effect. And since then, basically the reason why China wants to do this is to respond to the increasing public concerns about online fraud and misuse of personal information. And so that's why, over the past 2 years, we saw 2 different drafts, and then finally it got passed in August. So just at a very high level, the Chinese law shows a lot of similarities with the GDPR. The law also has extraterritorial reach, so the PIPL applies to personal information processing even outside of China. And several concepts like privacy best practices, like data minimization, purpose limitation, are also reflected in the law. So, and broadly speaking, the definition on personal information, sensitive information, individual rights, they are also similar to GDPR, but of course, there are always some slight minor differences. But the biggest significant difference between GDPR and the Chinese law is the provisions related to national security and cross-border data transfers. So the CIC, they basically say, if you want to transfer data, hey, you have to pass a security assessment for 2 types of controller. First, critical information infrastructure operators. And the second type is if you are information handlers, you process a large amount of personal information, you also have to go through that as well. And the unique thing is that there are also political provisions in the law. So PIPO will allow the government to establish a blacklist of overseas data controllers and processors from processing Chinese personal data if they violate Chinese national security. It's very unclear what that means at the moment. And those provisions are unprecedented because no other privacy law have those elements, and they seem very unique to the Chinese political system. So just to kind of sum up, my high-level key takeaway, though we see the final version of the law today, enforcement will be a challenge, and China currently does not have an independent data protection authority. So they still have to struggle, through the bureaucracy like CAC and MPS being both the regulators and enforcement agencies. So international stakeholders will have a lot to navigate. And of course, we can talk more about China's privacy law, but I guess I'll just pause here and turn it back to Rinda.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think you've given some really interesting ideas, especially about the fact that PIPL will allow the government to establish a blacklist. And I wonder, what your take on that is in terms of how it's being implemented, and thus kind of maybe using that as a lens, how you think the PIPL will generally affect data flows and interoperability.
Sure. So perhaps I can emphasize that there's one new tax in the final law that includes a new provision explicitly say that they will allow cross-border data flows when treaties or international agreements are in place. Also, the final text also adds a new requirement that personal information exporters, you need to ensure, wherever you transfer data to, it at least meets the standards of PIPL. But so I think that overall, they are trying to signal that the Chinese government is interested in international agreement on data transfer and trying to encourage, I'm hesitate to use like mutual recognition because that is a very westernized term. And that's, it's not clear if they really kind of trying to reflect this concept. But it is still, I would say, under the final PIPL, at least they are interested. But it remains unclear to me whether the Chinese regulators are trying to facilitate interoperability between Chinese privacy law and other jurisdictions, or China was just trying to bring the international privacy playbook more in line with Chinese national security approach. we don't know yet. Maybe they might try to do both, but that is a very important area that we have to continue to watch.
Thank you so much. I think just lots of interesting insights and new learnings for me. And I think, again, it's a good time to move to Udbhav to maybe use that as a comparison for the Indian context. And Udbhav, we all know that the Personal Data Protection Bill is currently before the JPC, the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Just first off, do you have any sense of what are some of the changes that are potentially being discussed at the JPC level?
Thanks so much, Rinda, and thank you so much to MediaNama as well for having me for this conversation. With regard to the latest sort of iteration of India's data protection law, there have been some pretty concerning reports in the media over the last, I would say, approximately month and a half to two, that really show India's draft data protection bill sort of becoming an internet bill almost of sorts, right? Where the scope of the law, which so far, at least for its approximately 2.5 years of existence, has largely been focused on pure play data protection and privacy, seems to be expanding to include intermediary liability, special obligations for social media platforms, and many other issues that are contemporary to India, and that like there have been policy developments on these respective fronts, and it somehow seems like this law is being used as the first out of the door legislation that may deal with these issues. So let's just load it with as many of the things that we really want to get out of the way as possible. So whether it's safe harbor, whether it's encryption, whether it's lawful access, whether it's like broadly how the liability of online platforms in India all seem to apparently be a part of the latest bill. However, I would like to state that like at this stage, these are very much conversations that are taking place within the JPC and within the committee. So it's not that the bill has been introduced in the parliament. It's not that like we've gotten any strong indication that all of these things are things that the government, which is independent of the JPC, and it's the government that will ultimately pass this law, is okay with this fairly radical expansion of scope. So I think that we will have to wait a little and see what the final version of the law is, but some of the initial trends are pretty worrying.
So one thing I'm hearing you say is that if you had to recommend something to the JPC, it would be that don't expand the scope of the law, wait potentially for the amendments to the Information Technology Act, which apparently are also in the offing, maybe at a later time. And the IT Act may be a better place to house regulation concerning intermediary liability. So then if you have to think about any recommendations that you would give to the government when they actually table the data protection law, right? Whether it's concerns about regulatory independence that we've heard, sort of our panelists speak about, whether it's about concerns of institutional trust, culture, what are some of the concerns or recommendations that you would give to the government in terms of the Personal Data Protection Bill, hopefully 2021, 2022, whenever it's tabled in Parliament?
Sure. I would say that firstly, everything that I think every single panelist has spoken about so far are things that would apply as things that need to be improved in India's data protection bill. The independence of the regulator, the need to ensure that there is a more sort of systemic integration of what privacy means and how like it would operate in an Indian context, empowering the regulator and like its involved entities with sufficient funds in order to be able to meet those mandates are all, I think, things that one should see in the law. I would just like to make 2 points that I think have been touched upon in this conversation and in the previous one, but I think could be elucidated upon. The first is this broader idea that very often I think we're seeing this notion of digital sovereignty being used as a fig leaf to include provisions or push for ideas that may not necessarily be in the best interests of the subjects, so-called, of the bill, which would be Indian residents and within the territory of India. And I think that one of the more interesting ways in which that's manifesting itself is some of the conversations around data localization and adequacy, which I think we've had some conversations about it and we'll also have some more about tomorrow. But both the latest draft from very late 2019, as well as some of the rumors around how it's being amended, showcase that it's quite likely that it may be a little worse than what we have seen from the 2019 bill, in that the localization provisions may be harsher, and that the powers that the government and the regulator would have to implement those localization provisions may also be quite widespread. And the reason I think that if I could give one advice, I would ask the government to necessarily reconsider the current approach, but not the idea of digital sovereignty, is I think that digital sovereignty fundamentally is used means different things to different people, right? And when it and I think that like investigating the idea of digital sovereignty, seeing what are the ideas there that will truly empower like local communities and local economies, which are good things, and what are things that will prevent them from really being a part of a global internet, and looking behind what the policy motivations behind some of these provisions are, what are the ways in which one can meet those policy objectives without causing some of the collateral damage that the current approach will cause, are all things that I think have been said to the government over the last approximately 3 years in a fairly consistent manner by a wide variety of stakeholders. So it'll be interesting to see that reflected in the actual bill by providing more clarity as to how it would operate, but also making clear that when it does operate, it's not necessarily going to like impact India's presence on the global internet, including the role that like everyone from companies to civil society organizations sort of really play in it. That would be one. I think the second issue with regard to what I would tell the government is definitely the role of the state in data protection. I think that the current provisions in the law are incredibly wide and allow the government almost too much leeway in determining which parts of those laws will apply to which aspects of the government. It's one of the few parts of the bill that I think has consistently gotten worse since the first draft actually came out all the way back in 2018, and the language has only made it harder and harder for an independent regulator to really be able to enforce the provisions of that bill on government entities. And I think that the argument is usually couched in like law enforcement access and intelligence agencies, but the consequences of I think that broader provision will likely exceed that, whether it's financial regulators, whether it's its interface with things like the Right to Information Act, which is India's Freedom of Information Law, are all different aspects that aren't A, necessarily getting enough attention, and B, just by being couched under that broader heading of law enforcement and intelligence agency, like broadly national security access, are still being included in the scope of the bill. So those would definitely be my top two considerations. There's a third point around non-personal data and whether that should be a part of the bill or not, why that definitely deserves separate regulation, including the committee of experts in India that's looking at it. But I think we can get into that later.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think this is a great time to move to data localization, answer some of the questions we've already getting. But before that, Nikhil, you wanted to say something.
No, I'm just thinking after hearing everybody speak, I'm just wondering about whether the battle was lost for the internet the moment the framing shifted from privacy to data protection, because data protection essentially has in it the idea of data sovereignty, and it juxtaposes two, or it sort of has two competing aims of at one level enhancing privacy, at another level of sort of preventing the loss of economic capital in terms of data. And the moment you have those two as conflicting sort of goals, no one's ever going to be satisfied. So I'm actually just wondering about what everyone thinks from their jurisdiction's perspective. What is the kind of internet we will see 5-6 years down the line, when all of our jurisdictions have strong data protection regulations or laws in place that also that focus on data sovereignty, that focus more on data protection, and it becomes difficult for the world to come together in terms of enabling cross-border data flows. So if, let's say, we're having this conversation over the internet, the moment there is data localization for this kind of data, how do you think this is going to impact our experience as users? I know it's a long-winded question, but I'm just thinking about it from our experiences perspective, right? What kind of internet will we see? Will we be able to access global services? Will we be able to communicate with each other? What does the future hold for us? Because that it's hard to argue against a sovereignty angle, in that data protection context versus a privacy context.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Does anybody want to take the first? Yeah, Luca.
Hello, thank you for this. I think first, to clarify, because I think what is useful from the Latin American perspective, copying, if you want, from Europe is a distinction between privacy and data protection, which is not so clear in other frameworks. For instance, the US only speak about privacy in mixing everything. And in Latin America and Europe as well, because they started this distinction, this is very clear cut. So privacy is a right of opacity. It's the protection of your private sphere. Data protection is a right of transparency. It's being able to know clearly who is collecting your data, for what purposes they are using them, and with whom they are sharing, and to have control, to exert control on this, right? So I think we have to start with having this in mind, because it's very useful then to understand what we want. In terms of data protection, we want people to be able to exert control on their data. And this is really how it has been framed for the first time in terms of informational self-determination in Germany in 1983 with the census case. The same reasoning was applied by actually India in the Puttaswamy case. It's about letting people being able to exercise their fundamental right and also to participate in democratic life and to exercise pre-existing right. The same reasoning was applied in Brazil last year when the Supreme Court of Brazil recognized in the jurisprudence the creation of a new right to data protection. But although this has not been integrated in the Constitution, there is an amendment that is going on, but it's not being integrated yet. But why am I saying this? Because if we understand that privacy is only about protecting the private sphere, whereas data protection is about protecting privacy plus a wide range of other interests. That there are freedom of expression. If you know that you are not surveyed, you speak freely. It's about participating in the democracy and in the economy of your country. If you know that the data are controlled and not harvested only by foreign companies, you have an incentive in being creative and create innovation, right? So that, but this is of course in conflict. There is a tension with free flow of data in the conception that we have in this moment. Why? Because the free flow of data are highly asymmetric. And the reason why there are strong arguments for data sovereignty and data protection is used to strengthen data sovereignty, and data sovereignty is used to strengthen data protection, is because the current data protection, data flows are highly asymmetric. There are only a couple of very powerful US corporations that harvest at scale all data globally. Now some Chinese corporations as well. But what we have to understand, and I think in this case, I think the strongest digital sovereignty provision that India has ever adopted was banning zero rating 5 years ago, because it actually provided a strong incentive for startups to create innovation, because they knew that the market was free and the data were not going to be hoovered by a couple of foreign corporations. So that was, in my view, it is not a data protection related measure. It is a telecom related measure, but it had an enormous digital sovereignty and data sovereignty impact. So we really have to strike this distinction between privacy and data protection and really understand what we want as interest, and also realize that sadly there is a tension between free flow of data and data protection. And then what do we want to facilitate? In the ideal world, there would be global data protection rules that to which everyone is bound to, and we don't have to have that digital sovereignty because everyone respects the same rules and everyone plays according to the same book. Sadly, we don't have this yet, and therefore there will be data sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and this kind of situation we have now.
But if I may just counter that, Luca, you also have a situation where with the implementation or the mixing of digital sovereignty or data sovereignty with data protection, we don't necessarily have informational self-determination for individuals. It is informational self-determination for the state, for its citizens. So essentially, it doesn't seem as if, at least in the Indian context, that the citizens have a choice of allowing their data to go freely across the world, even if they wanted to.
But sorry, if I can, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but just to counter this, it's because the narrative of digital sovereignty is something extremely fuzzy. And the fact that the Indian government or the Chinese government or the European Commission says that something is digital sovereignty is not something universally agreed, right? So it is, of course, it is misused to put in what the specific speaker wants to have. Actually, we are publishing a volume on digital sovereignty in the BRICS next year, precisely analyzing what are the narratives in the BRICS countries, because they are very different from what we can find in the European Commission or in other countries that are now advocating for what was created basically by China 8 years ago. It is very heterogeneous, the concept of digital sovereignty. So I would not say that the problem is digital sovereignty itself, is how we define it.
So thanks, Luca. Just to take that question to everybody else in terms of what kind of an internet will we have 5 years from now? Will we be able to have this conversation online 5 years from now?
Alexa, do you want to? I see your hand is raised.
Sure, yeah. I just want to quickly provide some thoughts on digital sovereignty and data localization, because Nikhil asked about that. So in the case of China, I would say I'm a little concerned about the kind of long-term trajectory because the push for data sovereignty is somewhat brings information under government control more in the case of China, and allows the government to identify potential threatened individuals. And in the long term, it could complicate privacy, data protection, and the freedom of speech. But again, because of Chinese unique system. And I do want to emphasize that though the PIPL provides a lot of really positive, really good elements to protect Chinese consumer, similar to some of the GDPR concepts. But it still worries me that the Chinese government still retains broad and very vague legal authority in its law to potentially access data for national security purposes that might ultimately be at odds with individual privacy. So that area just remains like an area we have to continue monitor. And next, I want to just make a few comments on data localization. My concern about the false appeal of data nationalism as reflected in the Chinese approach is that I would reiterate again that the value of data comes from how it's being used and is not where it is stored. So in the case of an authoritarian country like China, the data localization measure support surveillance and social and political control. So it's not surprising like countries like Russia and China are the most significant users of data localization because it'll align with their political goal. So requiring data to be stored and processed domestically, I just want to emphasize it does not drive economic value. In fact, it's a matters about how many data come into your country, how many data flow out, and how many times they can be reused and exchanged with the rest of the world. That is where the value of the data can be created multiple times. So the false appeal of data localization is thinking that you can just store all the data in your own country and then you will make the best use of it. It's just not the practical approach, but in fact, you want to make sure it flows in and out, exchange with the rest of the world. That is what you're gonna gain the most value, and that's gonna how position you as a digital power. So I just want to perhaps clarify some of the data localization misconception that's out there in the world.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Andrew, coming to you, there was actually a question from Amit, which you sort of answered, which is about how is South Africa and the African Union dealing with the ownership of non-personal data and the cross-border flow of data. And to that, I would just add, based on the discussion that we've had, especially after Schrems 2, how do you see data transfers being impacted? We've spoken a lot about data localization, data sovereignty. So what role do you also think that Schrems 2 will play in the future, kind of in South Africa?
Well, so firstly, the African Union policy tends to take the approach that sovereignty and localization are two different things. So sovereignty can be realized through requiring protection and reciprocity, so protection of your own citizens' data in exchange for offering the same kind of protection. So sovereignty and localization can be separated out quite clearly conceptually in the African Union approach. The South African approach has been critiqued. So that was a draft policy. So hopefully, as a result of all the critique, we'll see a better and more nuanced policy. It was fairly unnuanced. So there were the one claim, which was the least nuanced, was data that's produced in South Africa, regardless of whether it's personal or not, is the property of South Africa. So, you know, as the moment people start using the word property anywhere near data, you realize it's a sort of deep conceptual incoherence and that somebody needs to basically do their homework. So it's a very unsophisticated, sort of crude approach, but the rest of the policy isn't so crude. So there was a lot of support for open data, which is something we haven't seen raised much in this conversation, which is super important. The idea that governments themselves should open up non-personal data so that will spur innovation, as well as transparency and accountability. The argument that's most likely to have traction in Africa is people will innovate on this and build the kind of services which governments, frankly, in Africa, most of the time don't have capacity to create. So that's one important aspect. The non-personal data in the South African policy, the sort of claim is South Africa must benefit, and there might be some attempt to localize, essentially to try and extract value. And of course, everything that Alexa has said, that localization won't get you value. So, you know, we've heard the data is the new oil, and the first person to say that apparently said, and like oil, you actually need to go and, you know, refine it and crack it and make plastic. It's no use just sitting on its own. But I think even despite his caveat, I think data is the new fish, right? If you overexploit the fish in the ocean, then you'll end up with none. You'll destroy the ecosystem. And if you have a huge pile of fish, you have a problem, right? They'll rot and you'll get scavengers coming, and you've got to move them along and you know, sell the fish. You can't just have a huge pile of fish. It doesn't help you. In fact, it's a problem. So everything that Alexa said, I think, applies, and that hasn't necessarily fully filtered through in policy debates across Africa. There are people making those kind of points. But to come a little bit back to Nicole's question related to all of this, so one worry is that data localization will have us all in our silos, and we'll end up with an internet in which, you know, we can barely speak to each other. Maybe if we're anonymized, but there'll be another push against anonymization, also for political purposes. So you know, otherwise we could say, oh, we'll just be anonymized and we'll talk.
We're all
without any personal data.
We're all exchanging facial data right now, Andrew.
Yeah, exactly. So the real question is, for me, will we end up with the silos or not? Well, this will depend to some extent on a global political economy. The reason I think that localization is getting so much power right now is there's not a great alternative. The alternative is Facebook can exploit us. So the real question is, actually, will the United States create a data regime that protects personal privacy and then put its political power behind it? So will it decide that it's not going to tolerate its own extractive corporations that engage in surveillance capitalism from doing that? If it creates some kind of boundaries for surveillance capitalism, that will then exercise a real global pull for certainly for African economies and maybe not places like China, but for a lot of economies to say, all right, we can now still tolerate this sort of integration with the US economy because there's this level of protection. For as long as the United States fails to offer that kind of protection and fails to rein in the surveillance capitalism, then I think that then the danger is there's not an alternative, right? So when we first got the internet, we had a lot of governments who really didn't like this idea of the internet, undermining their sort of control over information. And nobody was successful in stopping it, except, I guess, China to some extent. Everybody else, basically, the advantages were too much, and so they had to, swallow their unhappiness with the technology and just get on with it. But now I think it's different, because I think the US is failing to provide an attractive alternative. All right, and maybe the EU is providing an attractive alternative. The trouble is the barrier for EU compliance is very high. And so you might, as an economy, let's say the South African economy, want to say, well, we want to get, we want the EU to sign off and send us data, and we can send them data, and we'll comply with all their standards. But it's, it requires resources. It's not that simple for all developing countries to do that. So maybe the EU provides an attractive alternative, and there'll be an EU sphere, an EU internet, and then there'll be an American internet, which will continue with surveillance capitalism, and then maybe there'll be some other blocks. But the real question for me is, if the US were to provide a sufficient protection for personal data that the Europeans are willing to sort of buy into, then that's got a lot of gravitational sort of pull for other economies. If they don't, then is the EU strong enough on its own? And that's I don't know. That's a bit of a seeing into the future question.
I mean, I think those are great comments, especially in light of the testimony we've heard about, Facebook's misuse and its, placing profits over people, and kind of how that's even affected democracies. And I think it raises questions about whether the inaction, or kind of maybe the commissions by private actors, is actually pushing, data sovereignty, and is allowing governments to claim data concerns to push potentially data infringing or surveillance, privacy infringing legislation. So there's a couple of country-specific questions, which I'll first go to, and then ask you a bunch of direct questions that we've got. So for you, Uddhav, Vani is asking, shouldn't transparency be a fundamental step taken by organizations, public or private, welcoming the implementation of privacy processes, especially in India? So shouldn't transparency be something that should be welcomed by both public and private actors in terms of the privacy processes in India? And connected to that, Niam is also asking about the health ID, which again talks about a state government ID and using personal data. So how you think transparency and accountability would be relevant in that context?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that transparency is fundamental to both helping create a culture of compliance with privacy, preserving and respecting practices, but also in order to hold entities that do privacy processing of data that may be privacy violative to account. And I think that in India's current data protection bill, there are some positive steps that do point towards the direction of transparency. There's, for example, privacy marks or labels and ratings that regulators can issue, assign to companies to say that this is how good or bad you are. But there are many other aspects of, I think, transparency, fundamentally decisions that corporations make with regard to, or entities may make with regard to which service they want to provide, which they don't, their privacy impact assessments and things like that, that don't really fall within that per se ambit. And I think there are many lessons that I think people who work in this field can learn from both common players as well as different ones who work on content regulation, where the idea of transparency has become, I think, the fundamental rallying cry around which a lot of the work on holding large platforms accountable is taking place, both to publics, but also to governments as a whole. And one can see that in laws like the Digital Services Act, for example, in Europe, that's currently being considered as well. So I think, yeah, there is certainly more that can be done, but a lot of it, I think, is also going to be dependent upon the regulator that does decide to implement, that does end up implementing the law in India and how they go about doing so. In the context of health ID, I think that even if we had a strong data protection law, there are so many loopholes that one could still see this playing out, right? One would be maybe the National Health Authority would be excluded from the purview of the data protection law. That's one entire hypothetical where it would essentially be irrelevant whether we had a law or not. The second would be that it is included under it, but there isn't enough transparency, and it's just a typical sort of opaque regulatory structure where the approval is granted and then the program really proceeds without enough public sort of like consultation and deliberation on something that would have the sort of impact that it did. And I think we've also seen a lot of that with India's previous like trysts with digital identity that have played out over the last approximate decade as well. Like things are better now than they were in some ways in the past, but it has taken a lot of work to really get there, and transparency being a part of like that initial design of the whole system would have mitigated many of these concerns. So in short, like agree with everything. I think transparency is incredibly important, but one really needs to like also look at how it's not just what the law says needs to be transparent, but how it's implemented in practice that will lead to like some of its more second order effects. Thanks.
The $1 million question, which we're all waiting to see if India ever even gets a privacy law or a data protection law. Luca, this is for you. Parth is asking, how is the privacy tech space emerging in Brazil? The convergence of the legal and engineering domain in privacy is seminal to the effective implementation of privacy. So he would appreciate some views on this. And are there any incentives from the Brazilian government in promoting small-scale enterprises in building such tools or solutions? If you want, I could repeat the question.
No, I get it. I got it.
Yeah.
And actually, it is a very important question to which there is no official answer, because there is no real incentive from the government to promote this, and which is, I think, a pity. And also, if you want a sort of failure in implementation, if you want to, the best way to regulate, and this is something that the US have experimented since the 60s when they were conceiving the technology we utilize today, and China has been experimenting over the past 20 or 30 years, is that you have to invest a lot of money into your industrial policy. You have to have people, the best way to regulate, what the digital technology has clarified to everyone is that there is not only law and contract as form of regulation. If one reads what Lessig was writing at the end of the 90s, it's really what we see daily. Technology is the best way to regulate society. Not the best, the most effective way to regulate society at this point is absolutely not the best, because it has to be in synergy with the values we want and with the law that we want and the regulation, the oversight we want. But the most effective way to regulate us being permanently connected is through technology. So it means that if you want to have to bake your values, and I'm not speaking, I'm really agnostic about values in this moment. If you want to have democratic value, authoritarian values, whatever value you want, if you want to have them bake into the regulation, you need to invest to promote the technology that will bake those values, right? So it's completely absurd to adopt a law that protects personal data and then do not invest into law text, legal text that will promote the control of personal data from the individuals. So the question is very good. It's an excellent question. And all regulators, all governments actually that have budget and that adopt laws, then they should invest into these startups or engineering of technology according to the laws, because otherwise it's completely useless. And there is an obvious market incentive into do the opposite of what data protection laws prescribe. So unless we create a market incentive in do exactly what the data protection laws prescribe, we will have the letter of the law that says something and the practice and technology that do exactly the opposite. So sadly, in Brazil, at this stage, there is no program to incentivize data protection compliant startups. There are a lot that are emerging, but with very different results. It is it's for sure a very, it's actually also a almost booming field of startups, because there is a market incentive not really to protect data, but to provide some solution to all those who have to protect, according to the law, to protect data and have no idea of how to do this, because that is a very important lesson also from the Brazilian experience. If you just adopt a law and create an authority, then you still need to educate the entire population or to give them tools to implement the law. Otherwise, they will either ignore the law or implement it completely wrongly. So if you want to have compliance that is in accordance to what the law says, you have to create solutions and you have to have, the authority has to have a very pedagogic role in this, and the state has to create a very good incentive from the market to provide this kind of solutions. Otherwise, as it's obvious in Brazil over the past couple of years, you will keep on having major data leaks every day or week because people don't know how to protect data or do not have any incentive to do so, despite the law creating an obligation to adopt all the technical and administrative measures possible to protect law and to secure the treatment of personal data. So yes, there is a need for this. No, there is not an official program fostering this kind of innovation that would be highly beneficial for society.
Yeah, that is a really great answer. So we just maybe have time for one last question. So this is open to all panelists. So the notion of data sovereignty is misplaced, Parth asks. When the local state actors may exploit such data, given the power imbalance and social inequities, what do the panelists think in fixing liability on such actors? Should the government compensate the individual for transgressions attributed to such state actors? So I think a lot of you have spoken about, problems of implementation, institutional trust. So the question really is the notion of data sovereignty misplaced when local state actors may exploit such data, given power imbalance and social inequities? And should the government compensate individuals for transgressions attributed to such state actors? Does anybody want to take, yeah, so Andrew first. Yeah.
So I think this depends very much on, a country's own sort of legal and regulatory system. So, so in a country like South Africa, it might be more important to have a class action instead of waiting on a government actor that might be under-resourced to take action and then compensate. So let's say fine and compensate. If you let people mobilize themselves and bring a class action, then that might be more powerful. But I think it also raises another point, which is, so you essentially, as you have concentrations of personal data, this creates a hazard, a public hazard. And what are the different ways of approaching it if you're going to have leaks and so on? So one approach obviously is, you want to, after the fact, you want to, let's say, fine and compensate people, or you want to allow litigation. But what about the preemptive methods? And so one of the recommendations in the African Union data policy framework is that competition authorities look at the structure of local markets from almost sort of from a cybersecurity perspective of like, will this actor have too much data such that if they're compromised, that's 40% of the people in the country's personal data compromised, and then say refuse a merger or require some kind of measures so that so competition regimes, there was a narrowing of competition regulation because of the Chicago School, but now there's a new competition regulation, right, which says the public interest is really important. And so this could be one of the factors that you can actually say, well, no, this local champion that's going to get 80% of the data under data localization, well, we can't, that's too much of a risk. It's too much of a target for hackers. We've got to break it up, or we've got to make sure that they can't be a single point of failure in the country. And of course, not every country can do that. You have to have the market of a certain size, right? If you're a smallish economy, you might just have one local player. And that contraindicates data localization again. So I think the question of compensation is a good one, but there's a bigger question, which is, what are the different regulatory levers?
Thanks so much. Luca, for you, we are really short of time, so I'm going to ask you to keep it short because we've already extended it. There are sort of maybe one more question. And while you're answering, Luca, there's also another question in the chat saying, I missed the name of the scholar at the end of the 19th century mentioned by Luca, who said that technology is the most effective way to regulate. Can anyone type in the name? So if you could maybe just mention the name again or type in after, that would be great.
I was referring to the works of Lawrence Lessig in the late 90s, early 2000s. Also, Joel Weinberg wrote a lot about this. If you drop me an email, I can send you some literature as well. But just for a very quick comment regarding this last question on digital sovereignty, I would like to reiterate that it really depends on what is the content of digital sovereignty, and it is not a well-defined, it is not a universally defined content, and it can be something extremely positive if you have the individual at the center of the concept. So digital sovereignty of the individual it could be something very positive if we have the local or national digital economy at the center, so thriving digital economy that fosters local innovation. It can also, of course, be used for geopolitical reasons, and some governments, especially in the BRICS grouping, one has to be honest, flirt with authoritarianism, if not implementing it blatantly. So it is something that we have to keep in mind. It's a very multidimensional concept, and I think is not so. There is not dichotomy. We are in favor or against digital sovereignty because we don't know what is it yet. So it is that's the reason why we are doing research, and I'm again releasing a book that I'm organizing with my friend and colleague Min Jiang next year, precisely because we want to understand what are the BRICS concept narratives of this, and try to put forward some solutions, some ideas on which a constructive dialogue on digital sovereignty could be constructed indeed.
Thank you so much. And the last question, Udbhav, this is for you from Leher. The draft of India's data protection bill gives a tremendous amount of discretion to the regulator, the DPA, in terms of determining how the bill will actually be implemented. How do you see this playing out? For instance, broad guidelines given by the regulator followed by disputes over whether the companies are or are not compliant? Or will there be restrictive guidelines that do not keep up with technological advances? Or will the law enforcement machinery that may or may not be equipped to apply these guidelines and determine compliance?
Excellent. I mean, I think that in a way, the leeway that's been given to the Data Protection Authority is a good thing. If it were more independent, it would be a fantastic thing, because the cornerstone of an effective independent regulator is an entity that can come up with high-level framing guidelines, also have the ability to enforce those guidelines. So, and that's the case with the DPA here. And I think that covers some of the sort of sub-questions, because the Indian Data Protection Authority is very much one that will be a quasi-adjudicatory body. So like both the enforcement wing, the entities that will do some of the initial like investigations with regard to like breaches of the law are all going to be present within the DPA. So I think that making it more independent, ensuring that some of the lessons that India has learned from setting up regulators like TRAI and the SEBI, which are the India's telecom and securities regulators respectively, are pretty useful lessons that we can learn in this case. And the more independent the DPA is and the more empowered it is, both in terms of resources but also discretion, I think that the greater the odds of it successfully fulfilling its mandate. That said, there are still things that I think in India's data protection law that can clarify some of those provisions, provide a little more detail, and also provide a framework for how, if things go wrong at the DPA, where, for example, if we end up getting one that isn't as independent as one we would like, what are avenues that may be available for individuals or organizations to challenge decisions is also a pretty important one. And I think that in that, the data protection bill deals with it in like, I think a little open and shut manner, saying that like you can take things to court, but like thinking through that, creating some like processes via which that can happen. I think some things that to a limited extent can happen in the law, but largely are things that subsidiary regulations would deal with once the law itself is notified.
Yeah, I think that's very important. You know, it's one thing to have a law, as everyone sort of mentioned, in the actual implementation. And I think the independence of the regulator and the provision to appeal the decision becomes really important. Thank you so much. Nikhil, do you have any sort of final words as well?
Thanks, Vrinda, and thanks for some fantastic moderation. Actually, Udbhav's point is a great segue to tomorrow, because our very first session has two current data protection commissioners and one former data protection commissioners, and we're planning to talk to them about the real brass tacks operational challenges that they have faced. What are the powers that they wish they had? What are the challenges that they've faced? So I think this is we're going into much more detail on this tomorrow. I just wanted to also take off from where Luca left off. There is, yes, a positive way of looking at digital sovereignty. We've seen last year a pushback against the monopolization of the charges that for example Google was imposing on Indian developers to its app store, which was completely would have crippled the Indian app ecosystem. And there are monopoly issues to take into consideration, but I just wanted to say that we need to proceed with caution here. Back in 2011, 12, 13, I used to say that when India brought about a tax on online advertising, it was basically meant to tax Google, because before that, online advertising was not taxed just the way newspaper advertising wasn't taxed. And the collateral damage of that Google tax was on small mobile advertisers and ad networks. We have to be careful, and as much as Facebook is giving us a reason to regulate for privacy and data protection, we need to ensure that the collateral damage isn't the openness of the internet. And so there's a balance to be found. There needs to be local growth. There needs to be a reduction in monopolization. And I think Andrew's point about the US regulating its businesses from an antitrust perspective as well, from a privacy perspective, will really help perhaps reduce the damage that some of the more egregious digital sovereignty initiatives that governments seem to be taking will have. Like I mentioned, tomorrow we'll also discuss cross-border data flows. We're going to discuss how data protection commissioners are working, what makes their job difficult. And importantly, we're also going to speak with chief privacy officers on how they went about reshaping their organizations to deal with data protection laws. What are the operational challenges that they faced, how they had to convince their marketing teams. So we're really going to get down into people who've gotten their hands dirty in terms of operationalizing privacy. And I think that's important for us to learn from as we move towards a data protection regulation in India. But thank you all for a fantastic day. Thank you all for being here. Please join in tomorrow. I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd also like to thank people who've supported making this discussion possible. Flipkart, Internet Society, Facebook, Mozilla, the Mobile Premier League, Omidyar Network, Paytm, Star India, Xiaomi for their support. Also to the Cyber BRICS project and Luca, the Center for Internet Society, and CCG at NLU Delhi for their help in actually putting together the program. Looking forward to tomorrow. Please do join in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. If Nikhil had any questions, if anybody had doubts and was on the fence, please join tomorrow. Thank you.